Chapter 584. In the boundless and vast universe, it was hard to find a word to describe the stars that shone eternally in the farthest reaches of the universe. There was a nebula that had just condensed and extended its first spiral arm. There was an ancient galaxy of unknown age hanging like a silver belt. The deep red and white coldness looked at each other from countless light years away in the dark background. The coldness and indifference of each other made all the onlookers feel that they were small and insignificant, giving birth to a sense of awe that made their bodies tremble. The staff on the red rose were already somewhat numb to the scenery outside the transparent dome. After years of working on various spaceships and the long and boring journey, they did not have the extra interest and energy to look at the starry sky outside the transparent dome. No matter how beautiful something was, it could not withstand the wear and tear of time and immutability. When they first met the girl who was like their first love, she was so beautiful that it was soul-stirring. After looking at her for a long time, she gradually became as boring as an old wife. In comparison, the interior of this extremely luxurious spaceship was still able to shock the people who had just joined the team after passing the review. Especially the blue artificial lake, it was even more unbelievable. The spaceships of the Empire had always been designed with the best performance and the least amount of materials. Before seeing this lake with their own eyes, who would have thought that a spaceship would be so extravagant and even crazy to accommodate an artificial lake? Faint starlight sprinkled down from the glass dome, accompanied by additional light inside the spaceship. It passed through the spacious and huge space and mixed with the metallic luster of the tall cabin walls. It fell on the surface of the water, illuminating the tens of millions of tons of seawater. It was so deep that the bottom could not be seen. The waves moved slowly, giving off the feeling of a vast ocean. The tens of millions of tons of seawater came from the most famous summer resort of the Gamma Coast in the southern hemisphere of Tianjing planet. It was said that there was the purest seawater in the entire empire there. At the edge of the artificial lake or sea inside the spaceship, the silver sand from Bansha Prefecture was laid. It was said that the sand grains there were the most well-proportioned and delicate, and the skin of the soles of human feet felt wonderful when stepping on it. On the artificial beach, there were hundreds of tropical plants swaying gently in the convective wind. There were hammocks between the trees, parasols made of large green leaves, and the faint sound of birds chirping could be heard. For such a beautiful scene to appear inside a spaceship in the silent universe, it was a bit shocking. This was the Red Rose, the top spaceship of the Emperor of the Empire. But no one knew why it appeared in the border star field far away from Tianjing planet in the deepest part of the sea, where the pressure of tens of millions of tons of seawater was the most concentrated. It was deathly silent. Unlike the beautiful scenery above the water, the silence here was filled with a suffocating aura of death. On the layer of fine sand at the bottom of the water, there was a naked man struggling and twisting. He wanted to shout out his pain, but he was suppressed by the heavy water from all directions, so he couldn't make a single sound. The powerful muscles on his back twitched, showing how much strength he was using at this moment, but he couldn't get rid of the heavy metal piece tied to his ankle and the black clue above it. There was no air to breathe, no straw to hold on to. There was nothing here, only water. The deep blue, cold seawater that pierced the skin like needles, the seawater that was everywhere, the seawater that was originally gentle but gradually became as heavy as lead, emitting a fishy smell of death. There was also no sound. The man in the depths of the water struggled as if he was crazy, and the water he stirred up couldn't be seen in most of the water. It was like watching life and death through a window, but it clearly conveyed the despair and pain of suffocation that person was in. A normal person who couldn't breathe for such a long time would have suffocated to death, but that man persisted for a much longer time. But he was only a human, not a god, so in the end, those unwilling and desperate struggles gradually subsided. His legs that were tightly tied to the clue kicked powerlessly, and the soles of his feet glowed with a trace of a tragic white. Finally, he stopped. He was like a pitiful dead fish that flipped over and vainly tried to look at the sky with its belly facing the ground before it died. The faint sound of an engine rang out from the surface of the water. The black clue was quickly pulled upwards, pulling the heavy metal piece and the naked man, who was unknown whether he was alive or dead, away from the fine sand at the bottom of the water. Along with a few fine waves of sand, it moved towards the surface of the water. On the beach on the other side of the giant lake, someone was currently fishing. With a light splash, a red koi fish was pulled out of the water by the thin line. It struggled with all its might to shake off its tail, but no matter what it did, it couldn't break free from the fatal hook. The naked man was pulled away from the surface of the lake by the black rope. Water flowed in reverse from his body, flowing along his wet black hair and pouring onto the surface of the lake. According to the calculations, the pressure at the bottom of the lake and the deep suffocation are already level 6 pain. Moreover, this type of pain and fear cannot be said to be tolerable at all. Why is this guy still smiling so happily? An expert from the Empire dressed in white overalls looked at the completely naked man on the workbench. He took out a towel and carelessly wiped this person's shoulders. He said in confusion, could it be that there really is a so-called near-death experience? Before he died, he saw the scene he wanted to see the most. You have to wait until he wakes up before you can ask him. Another slightly older expert said with a smile, I believe this hero of the Federation shouldn't mind sharing it with you. If he isn't willing, perhaps you can also enter the water and give it a try. Let's not. Thinking of the interrogation work in the past few days and the terrifying water torture in the large space, the expert couldn't help but shiver slightly. He picked up the nutrition needle beside him and inserted it into the body. The action of the expert of the Empire was very simple and rough, as if he was vaccinating a pig. The long and sharp needle pierced deeply into the body, but the man on the workbench who was covered in water didn't have any reaction. It seemed that he was in a deep coma. There were 2 flesh holes on his shoulders, inside of which were high-strength golden ropes. The wounds had already formed scabs, and they had peeled off after being soaked in cold water, revealing the tender flesh, which looked extremely horrifying. There were also dense scars on his skin after the torture. After experiencing hellish experiences, he probably wouldn't have much of a reaction to such a rough needle even if he was awake, right? 500 milliliters of awakening injection. Yes. The expert in white started to mix the medicine, but his eyes fell on the left wrist of the man on the workbench. He said in confusion, I'm still very interested in this bracelet. The material is very interesting. It's actually difficult to sample. When did the Federation develop such a high-strength metal? The problem is that it doesn't look like an alloy, and even X-rays can't penetrate it. The other expert shrugged and replied, I'm more curious about what material this guy's body is made of. His physiological data is ridiculously strong. Is it true that the hero promoted by the Federation is really made of special materials? The interrogation has been going on for so many days, and we haven't gotten any useful information. After the 2 experts of the Empire sighed, they looked at each other and shook their heads at the same time. We still lack professional equipment. The Red Rose was the personal spaceship of the Emperor of the Empire. Its space firepower and hull armor were naturally very strong, but it was not equipped with enough advanced detection equipment and torture tools. After all, no matter how perverted and cold-blooded the Emperor was, he would not be interested in enjoying the bloody scene on his own vacation spaceship. His Highness has ordered that if there is still no progress tomorrow, we will cut off his left arm first. The expert smiled and said, this way, we can analyze the bracelet properly. Besides, I don't think this guy's mind can be strong for much longer. Good idea. I've made this suggestion a long time ago. The other person shrugged and slapped the research subject on the workbench hard. His palm fell on the wet stomach of the man, making a crisp sound, as if he was slapping a piece of fresh pork in the market. The breathing and heartbeat frequency collected by the physiological monitoring equipment started to sound the alarm. The man on the workbench woke up, but his eyes were still closed. Only his thick and straight eyebrows, after being soaked in the salty water for so long, were still as calm as a knife in its sheath. The question was unoriginal, and the silence was unoriginal. The buzzing of the machine sounded again. The black thread lifted the man on the workbench, and the heavy metal piece tied to his foot moved horizontally out of the glass partition and came to the surface of the lake. Then it suddenly released, stirring up a cluster of waves, and sank again. That it was getting deeper and deeper. He slowly opened his eyes. The skin at the corner of his eyes had already festered due to being soaked in the salty water, but his eyes were still bright and clean. Looking at the water that was getting darker and darker, looking at the approaching fine sand at the bottom of the water, listening to the slight sound of water in his ears, and feeling the tingling pressure from his eardrums. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 1, 2, it should be earlier than last time. 13, it's time. He counted silently in his heart, and then his facial features began to twist in pain. He began to struggle again, unwilling and desperate. Opening his mouth wide, he tried to breathe the air that he could never breathe. Feeling the double torture of suffocation and silence, his lungs were burning. A string of pearl-like bubbles poured out from his lips, fleeing toward the surface of the water in panic. Falling into unconsciousness again, the man's body was stuck to the fine sand at the bottom of the water. Because of the struggle before falling into unconsciousness, the upper half of his body had sunk to the bottom of the thin layer of sand. The artificial lake formed by tens of millions of tons of seawater went straight to the bottom of the spaceship. Below the fine sand at the bottom of the lake was a transparent material cabin wall of the Red Rose spaceship. On the other side of the cabin wall, there was naturally an endless, boundless, and quiet space. In the dead and quiet space, the spaceship was moving at a steady speed. If someone looked closely from space at this time, they might be able to see a pale face on the other side of the glass. It was creepy. At this time, the pale face suddenly opened his eyes. He slightly narrowed his eyes, greedily looking at the universe that was right in front of him, but could never be touched. Chapter 585. The first time he sank to the bottom, the second time he sank to the bottom, the third time, Sulu could no longer count how many times this process had been repeated. That day, when he was captured on the Empire's battleship, he was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, he was already on this strange spaceship. Before the difficult torture process, he had carefully observed his surroundings. He was shocked by the spacious interior of the spaceship and the unimaginable facilities. However, when the torture officially began, he no longer had the extra energy to look at these blue lakes, silver sand, and green trees that appeared in space. He was forced to devote all of his physical strength, spirit, and willpower to the process of resisting the water. He had known before that when any ordinary thing exceeded a certain limit in front of a creature, it would always cause a great impact on the creature's nerves. For example, some visual effects were extremely disgusting. However, he had never thought that the weak water that could not be separated from at any time, silently pressing in from all directions, could make people feel such fear. The thin line between death and the cold feeling of being in a silent dead zone was something that no one would want to experience a second time. He had experienced it countless times. At the beginning of the cruel water torture, Sulu was in extreme pain. It was as if his lungs were about to explode, as if his skin was about to split open, as if his eyeballs were about to pop out, as if he was trying to breathe but could only feel the salty water pouring in. When mixed together with the absolute silence of the environment, it was very terrifying. Just like in Master Schiller's plays, where the audience's spirits were lifted and they established the correct view of good and evil retribution, the potential of human beings was always unexpected. They could always see hope in the midst of despair, until they found it. His nerves were much thicker than normal people. This was not only a conclusion of physical anatomy, but also a manifestation of a strong spiritual willpower. In such a desperate situation, he bitterly held on. His mind would occasionally be in a trance, but he never collapsed. Never collapsing was boring repetition. This kind of repetition made people numb. Before the catastrophe, there was an ancient torture called death by 1,000 cuts. At the end of the 1,000 cuts, the prisoners on the wooden frame who were on the verge of death probably would not feel any pain when the sharp knives fell on their pectorals. Sinking to the bottom of the water and then being pulled up, his physiological indicators were monitored. He was injected with nutrition injections, awakening injections, and routine interrogation. Every day after he was captured, he repeated this process. In this numbing and cruel process of torture, there was finally a change. One day, when his naked body was once again thrown into thousands of tons of cold and hard salty water, he was once again in a state of suffocation and unconsciousness. The mysterious lines that were severely damaged in his body seemed to have been awakened by something and began to gradually connect with each other. The weak heat completely ignored the cold salty water around him and began to slowly flow within those lines. Although the speed was extremely slow, it finally moved. Ever since he discovered this fact, Su Li's fear of suffocation had lessened a lot. Only in the depths of the water could he slowly recover his strength without worrying about being discovered by the Empire's people. When the mysterious power in his body gradually recovered to a third, he even looked forward to falling into the water more than 10 times a day, because the bottom of the water was not only death, but also hope. At the same time, Su Li began to pretend to be unconscious with the help of his engineer's meticulous calculation ability and his innate sensitivity to time scales. He tried to use the mysterious power in his body to deceive the sensitive monitoring equipment of the Empire's people. He did not know why the Empire's people did not kill him, but as long as he was alive, there was hope. However, without Tai Yuan, Zhou Yu, Magnolia, and the omnipotent charter computer, he still could not find a complete and feasible escape plan. Inside the Empire's spaceship in the silent space, even if he suddenly killed the 2 interrogators of the Empire, where could he escape to? The sand under his feet may be delicate and soft, but it was extremely painful when it rubbed against the skin of his face that was about to fester because of the water. Su Li's pale face buried in the sand did not show any expression at all. He just narrowed his eyes and looked greedily and sadly at the vast and endless black space outside the transparent cabin wall. Inside this extremely luxurious giant spaceship, there were all kinds of monitoring equipment, but the designer did not think of monitoring the cabin wall from the perspective of space outside the spaceship. Only at this moment in the sand could Su Li open his eyes. The black clue under his feet suddenly tightened, and the sharp pain from the rough metal wire rubbing against his festering ankle woke him up from his thoughts of fleeing and looking into the distance like a lookout. He immediately closed his eyes and relaxed his entire body, allowing the black clue behind him to pull him and the heavy metal block to quickly rush to the surface of the water. Floating at high speed, the cold salty water was like an inverted waterfall that kept washing his naked body full of wounds. The pain was so painful that it penetrated his bones. He still closed his eyes and said silently in his heart, "Fight." He had once tried to learn the Empire's language when he was in Group 7's camp in Sunset Province. However, there were too many dialects in the Empire. During the interrogation just now, he could only understand an extremely small portion of what the 2 Empire torture experts had said. However, it was precisely this portion that caused him to tremble in fear and decide to bring forward his escape plan. The secret in the bracelet could not be known by the Empire, and his left arm could not be chopped off by the enemy. So, other than fighting, what other choice did he have? There was no struggle, because things changed again. When he lay on the cold metal platform again with water dripping all over and was about to assume the unconscious and paralyzed posture that he had practiced countless times, he discovered that someone was wiping his body. The very soft semi-long fiber cloth had excellent water absorption properties. The person wiping his body was definitely not that perverted expert. That person would not be so gentle and meticulous, Sulu analyzed silently in his heart with his eyes closed. Immediately after, someone began to treat his wounds. Of course, it was only an extremely simple treatment of the ugly festering skin on his face. There was no in-depth treatment at all. It looked more like makeup, as if the person just did not want his face to be too ugly. A large robe-like garment was put on his body. The electrocardiogram on the monitoring device was as steady as before. Sulu, who was pretending to be unconscious, had countless shocked questions in the depths of his heart. For these cruel and cold-blooded people of the Empire, whether it was cutting off hands or heads, there seemed to be no need for them to put on clothes. Something like dignity before death had never happened between the soldiers of the Federation and the Empire. There was an injection in his neck. It should be an injection to wake him up, right? He thought to himself. Then, he discovered that he was being lifted onto some kind of mobile device and pushed out of the interrogation room toward an unknown place. The grinding sound of rolling wheels grinding against the ground was extremely ear-piercing. Chapter 586. In the quiet room, Sulu closed his eyes and pretended to be unconscious. He tried to figure out which part of the spaceship he was in, but it was all in vain. No one from the Empire had appeared for a long time, so the effect of the awakening injection should have taken effect, but he still didn't open his eyes because he didn't know if there was any monitoring equipment on him, and also because he didn't know how to act when he woke up. But at this time, the disguise had become a disguise that everyone knew. Soft and steady footsteps sounded, and someone walked to his bedside. Feeling a warm finger pressing on his wrist, Sulu became vigilant. The relaxed muscles on his body slowly gathered strength, but the double fiber cells of his muscles were still in a relaxed state. At this time, a strange power gushed out from the finger and rushed to his wrist along the skin that was in contact with the finger. No matter if it was the Federation or the Empire, if ordinary people were to face this moment, they would definitely be confused and feel a sense of mystery. How could the human body produce something like electricity? But Sulu was no stranger to this feeling. Many years ago, after practicing the 10 postures with the uncle, this similar power cycled back and forth in his body. It was just that the burning power in his body was gentle, and once it burst out, it was like a knife. But at this time, the power that was gushing out from the finger of the person beside his bed was violent and tyrannical to the extreme. After entering his wrist, it began to invade his surroundings. Sulu's willpower was extremely strong, and his ability to withstand pain was abnormally strong, but in the face of this power, he couldn't help but groan in pain. The power spat out by the finger on his wrist suddenly exploded. It was as if it had turned into countless scalding hot knives, wantonly cutting the mysterious power channels in his body. A kind of bloody feeling in his mind, a kind of unbearable feeling of the tender flesh inside his body being torn apart, made the hair on his arm stand on end. If this power was allowed to invade and cut, perhaps the mysterious lines that he had been practicing for many years, but didn't know the reason why, would break inch by inch in the next moment. Sulu didn't have much knowledge in this area, but that kind of hair-raising sense of crisis made him subconsciously urge the muscles beside his vertebrae to twitch abruptly. A scorching power suddenly burst out and passed through his body at high speed, along his arm all the way to his wrist, colliding with the power of the finger that had pierced into his body. The scorching torrent that had been accumulating for many days was only a trickle when it started from the back of his waist. However, when it reached his arm, it was already a vast river. When it reached his wrist, his power had turned into a giant beast formed from the icy cold seawater. It roared, and bit down fiercely. The room was still quiet, but there was a gust of wind. The bed sheets were swept up with a whistling sound and shattered into pieces. However, on the extremely small area of skin between the finger and the wrist, a scorched black color suddenly appeared, as if a tiny star was being reborn there. That terrifying finger was bounced a few centimeters away from the power of the collision. The owner of the finger let out a light hum, revealing a hint of surprise that he had long expected to suddenly encounter this situation. However, that finger pressed down even faster. The wrist, the middle of the forearm, the elbow, the upper arm, the armpit, the chin, and all the way to the head. Every finger strike was as soft and fast as the wind, unpredictable and as fierce as the ancient spear, unstoppable. Su Li's body was unable to react effectively in the face of the high-speed finger attacks that were as dense as raindrops, as well as the terrifying power that was spat out between the fingers. He could only instinctively activate the scorching power in his body to incessantly burn and transform, while he retreated quickly and passively. It was extremely difficult for him to resist the fierce force that was even stronger than the previous one. In some kind of religious language in Master Schiller's play, how many seconds did it take to flick a finger? And in this extremely short fraction of a second, how many times did the person beside the bed flick his finger? With a puff sound, like a steel pillar fiercely smashing into the muddy ground, Su Li finally raised his other hand and blocked the most dangerous strike of that finger. His eyes suddenly opened, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. His extremely taut body bounced up from the bed at almost the same time. His right hand that was spread out like a fan retracted, grabbing that steel-like finger. At the same time, his right knee fiercely slammed outwards, smashing towards the outside of that person's thigh. That person's finger suddenly retracted and turned into a fist. It seemed unreasonable, but in fact, it accurately avoided Su Li's right hand. It drew an arc and blasted towards the area below Su Li's earlobe. In an instant, Su Li bent his body, lowered his head, and raised his left arm close to his cheek, like an iron door that was tightly closed. The fist fiercely smashed into the arm, and the tip of the knee fiercely smashed into the thigh. The two people's attacks arrived at the same time, and at the same time, the sudden burst of power produced two loud muffled sounds. Without the slightest pause, the two people, whose figures could no longer be seen, quickly closed in again. The trembling left arm and the slightly stiff thigh no longer existed at this moment. What existed was a ruthless straight finger strike, a clean choke snap of the hand, a simple and clear stagger of the crotch, a sharp and sinister bending of the joint technique, and even more so, a pair of fists that were incomparably fast and fierce. What was even more frightening was that in these powerful close combat techniques, every movement was mixed with an enormous strength that was absolutely unimaginable to an ordinary person. The two figures dodging at high speeds caused the air in the room to vibrate and whistle, followed closely by an ear-piercing tearing and shattering sound. The sturdy bed was shattered into pieces by the overflowing power, and the bed sheets and torn clothes were swept up by the strong wind. In the midst of the mess, a figure flew out in a dispirited manner. Su Li fell heavily onto the hard ground. He immediately turned around and used his right hand to support his body, but was ultimately unable to stand up. He confirmed that his sternum was somewhat dislocated, and more likely, it was fractured. What made him feel even colder was that the scorching power that had been accumulating in his body for a long time was actually showing signs of dissipating. His slightly squinted eyes appeared slightly dim, but there was no despair, only unwillingness and stubbornness. He fiercely stared at the young imperial soldier not far in front of him, and somewhat strangely cracked a smile. The blood that seeped out of his gums and his mouth full of white teeth made his smile appear to be filled with an uncoordinated bitterness. His opponent was a young imperial soldier. He had a thin figure, and his skin was neither bronze black nor noble white. It was just a yellowish brown in between. Just like the feeling he gave off, he was extremely ordinary. If he were to be thrown into the crowd of people on Tianjin planet, there would definitely be no one who would discover his abnormality. However, to Su Li, who had fought with this person twice, no, 3 times, this young Imperial soldier was definitely not simple. If Brother Zheng, who was blithely shouting sighed, was like a dangerous gun tied in cloth, then this young Imperial soldier did not need to deliberately emit a powerful and intimidating aura. His body itself had an indestructible hardness and strength. He was a real gun forged from steel. Just like the alloy multi-layer forging gun that had fiercely pierced into the Black MXT's cockpit that day, cutting off Su Li's hopes of returning to the Federation. Su Li sat weakly on the ground, his eyes narrowed as he stared at the Imperial soldier not far away. He could feel the valiant and dangerous aura that was close at hand. He had previously guessed this person's identity in shock, but due to his ordinary appearance and gender, he did not dare to confirm it. Huai Chaoshi coughed softly and raised his arm to wipe the blood flowing out of his mouth, only to discover that the sleeve on his arm had been shattered and flown away like a butterfly during the battle. Then, he noticed the smile on the Federation soldier's face. "I've read the report. You were smiling every time you suffocated and passed out." The interrogators were very curious as to how the smile came about in such a state. Huai Chaoshi covered his chest and coughed again. Looking at Su Li on the ground expressionlessly, he asked, "Now that I think about it, I understand that you have the ability to hide from the surveillance equipment, recover in secret, and be ready to escape at any time. So, you can't help but feel happy in your heart. But I'm very curious. You can't keep up the disguise anymore, and more than half of the dirty spiritual gas in your body has been dispersed by me. Why are you still smiling?" Su Li moved his body with difficulty and leaned against the wall. His smile gradually faded, and he squinted his eyes and said hoarsely, "I'm smiling now because I've confirmed one thing. The reason why I lost to you on the warship that day was because I was seriously injured. If my body was intact, I should have had a chance to defeat you." The 2 bloody holes on his shoulders were bleeding non-stop. New flesh split open. It was a horrible sight. Huai Chaoshi turned a blind eye to it. After a moment, he said, "You assassinated Keaton first. The mecha was damaged too much, the cockpit was destroyed, and your body was wounded. Your close combat ability was greatly reduced. But after 2 battles, I'm sure that even if you were intact, you would still be no match for me. You won't know until you fight me." Su Li spat a mouthful of bloody saliva to the side and replied straightforwardly. A trace of mockery flashed across Huai Chaoshi's usually expressionless face. He said, "I allow the loser to carry out a mental battle. I only hope that you can hide the trace of fear in your eyes better." The road to death was in front of him. A powerful and young opponent was in front of him. As a soldier of the Federation, Su Li had to put up a brave front. However, after enduring the torture of millions of tons of water for so many days, after enduring for so long, because of such an unreasonable enemy, the sudden change of events, everything went up in smoke. His mood was sinking into despair, and his unwillingness was rising. Su Li raised his head, squinted his eyes, and said hoarsely, "I admit that I am indeed frightened by your great strength, but you also seem to be somewhat afraid, or perhaps worried that I will recover my health." "A little. You, a member of the Federation, seem to have the tenacious vitality of beetles." Huai Chaoshi said expressionlessly, "That is why I am thinking of a method to destroy that laughable desire to live of yours, or perhaps destroy the foundation of this desire. This body of yours is not bad." After saying this, he picked up a metal chair that could barely be considered intact in the room and walked in front of Su Li. Without any hesitation, he raised the chair over his head and then smashed it down forcefully. Blood flew everywhere. The sound of bones cracking rang out. Flesh was torn apart. When the Imperial officers in the monitoring room saw this bloody scene, they all couldn't help but frown. Several streams of warm blood slid across his face. Su Lu stared with his pair of not-so-large eyes at the young imperial officer in front of him and said hoarsely, "I am not threatening you. I also don't know why you all haven't killed me yet, but I suggest that you do." Chapter 587. Not a threat. In reality, it was still a threat. It had been many years since anyone dared to speak to Huai Chaoshu like this. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the Federation soldier in the pool of blood at his feet. His lips curled up into a smile. This person could endure torture for many days without uttering a single word. He was as silent and stubborn as a hot rock. Now, he began to speak harshly. Was it because he was slapped in the face? What an interesting guy. Huai Chaoshu took a step forward and raised his right foot to kick down. His military boot kicked Su Lu in the stomach, making him curl up in pain like a drunk river shrimp. Huai Chaoshu didn't have a special love or hate for this Federation officer in front of him. Since he was very young, he didn't like this boorish and obscene guy, but because of the needs of the royal family's rule, his father needed Keaton to live. Now that Keaton was dead, he was even happier. As for the person who killed Keaton, he naturally didn't hate him too much. But the other party was from the Federation, so he could only live in pain or die in humiliation. The door of the room slid open silently. The Empire's experts and soldiers rushed in and quickly took Su Lu away from the scene. They cleaned up the messy room as quickly as possible. Huai Chaoshu sprayed his favorite light orange air freshener around. Then, he sat by the window in silence for a moment and connected to planet Tianjing. "Great Master, is there any news from Fan Manor?" he asked expressionlessly into the communication device. The Empire's Royal Intelligence Agency officer on the other end of the communication device replied with a trembling voice, "We brought His Majesty's electronic seal there. Great Master, Fan Manor finally opened 3 doors, but we really couldn't find the name list." The officer paused and said respectfully, "Your Highness Su Mei, regarding the last name list, His Majesty has been ordering the Royal Intelligence Agency to try to recover it all these years, but we haven't been able to find any clues. The name list copied in Great Master Fan Manor is also incomplete." I know." Huai Chaoshu lowered her gaze and looked at the royal hibiscus flower symbol on the communication device. She said coldly, "I won't blame you for not being able to find it after so many years. However, Her Majesty is also very concerned about this matter. Therefore, I hope that you can make some progress. Even if it's incomplete, it would be good if you can recover some key words." The senior officers of the Royal Intelligence Agency nodded repeatedly and promised that they would continue to investigate and work hard. After the call ended, Huai Chaoshu sat in the room filled with the faint smell of orange and fell into silence again. Leaving Su Lu alive for the time being was not only because of the Empire's political needs, but also because the Empire's military wanted to obtain more information from him. However, what he was more interested in was Su Lu himself. The 8 rice true qi cultivated by the remnants of the Lees of Philadelphia was a great humiliation to the entire empire, especially to the high and mighty imperial family. Therefore, even if Su Lu was going to be cruelly executed, the imperial family still wanted to destroy the true qi in his body while he was still alive. It could be considered as another form of recovery. Previously, he had personally destroyed the true qi in Su Li's body. At the same time, he had confirmed that this person was indeed one of the remnants of the Lees of Philadelphia and walked the path of the Xiantian realm. However, the Royal Intelligence Agency and the military confirmed that this person was not Li Pifu's illegitimate son. Then, how did he manage to cultivate the 8 rice true qi of the Xiantian realm? Based on certain considerations, he had already asked for instructions from the Tianjing Imperial Palace and was forced to alert Great Master Fan Manor, who had been in seclusion for decades. However, there was still no clear answer. A small probability event was equivalent to an impossible event. Huai Chaoshu frowned slightly and laughed self-deprecatingly. Then, her expression changed slightly. She covered her mouth with her fist and coughed a few times. Intense, heart-wrenching coughs echoed in the room. Sulu, who was lying in the corner, had a pale face. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead like soybeans. Previously, he had already noticed that the spaceship had changed its course and was flying towards a blue and yellow planet in the distance. However, at this moment, most of his mind and will were controlled by the coughs. It was difficult for him to divert his attention to think about his next plan and action. Coughs were usually related to colds and unhealthy eating habits. It was not a big deal. However, for the current Sulu, if he did not solve this coughing problem, his future would be bleak. His originally hopeless escape route would be completely cut off. After the young Empire officer destroyed the power in his body that he had been accumulating for a long time, and after his ability to pretend to be unconscious was exposed, he was once again locked up in a solitary cell. At first, he did not despair. On the contrary, he did not hesitate to start cultivating again with his strong will. However, when the mysterious burning power in his body moved along the familiar channels to his chest and abdomen, it would be blocked by some invisible thing, making it difficult to move forward. If he forcibly moved the burning lines and tried to turn them into countless sharp blades to break through the invisible barrier, the net-like channels in his chest and abdomen would shrink at the same time. It was like a thin film pipe that tightly bound the blade. It was extremely painful to be cut. It could even be said that he was in so much pain that he wanted to die. At this time, his own burning power became as terrifying as the power that the young Empire officer spat out from his fingertips. Now, there were two paths in front of him. If he could not break through the barrier that the Empire officer had magically set up, the power that had accompanied him for many years and saved him countless times during life and death situations would become a dead pool behind his waist. It would no longer be able to play any role, and he would become an ordinary person. No one could endure the pain of the blade cutting through the sensitive passageways. Even if Sulu suddenly gritted his teeth and completed this action before he fainted from the pain, he was also clear that after those passageways were cut, he would probably end up in a very miserable state, worse than even an ordinary person. As an ordinary person, it was not difficult for Sulu to accept this fact. He had a good enough psychological foundation. However, now he was imprisoned in the distant empire, facing death and a future more terrible than death at all times. He could not just be an ordinary person. The Red Rose Royal spaceship was quietly parked at the edge of the transit base outside the atmosphere of Liban Star. The giant spaceship was close to 20 kilometers long, making the three-dimensional six-directional space base next to it look extremely small. In the next few days of docking and refurbishment, the space base would continuously send the materials on Liban Star to the Red Rose. It looked like this giant royal spaceship was like a big insect that greedily sucked the blood of herbivores. The fleet of Liban Star took off one after another, lining up in the vast universe outside the atmosphere, escorting the three light battleships that flew out from the Red Rose Royal spaceship and flew down. Chapter 589. Liban, an unremarkable second-class administrative planet in the vast territory of the Empire, gradually became different due to the two edicts from the Tianjing planet a few years ago. The establishment of the Empire's special tourism zone, the exaggerated investment by the Ministry of Finance, countless nobles and wealthy merchants came to join in the fun, and the Emperor's strict implementation of the interracial education experiment made this planet the center of the Empire's discussions. Being able to become a special tourism zone and help the Emperor justly divide the wealth of the nobles, the Liban planet naturally had enough beautiful scenery. Regardless of whether it was the spectacular Crimson Hill in the Western Hemisphere, the fog that covered the sky of Pine Cone Ridge, or the tens of thousands of stone peaks that pierced the sky of Yellowstone, they were all rare beauties that fully demonstrated the godlike carving ability of nature. The Liban planet also had the most beautiful scenery, and that was the mulberry trees that spread across the flat plains. Tens of thousands of square kilometers of mulberry trees were artificially divided into countless work areas. The rustling of the mulberry trees when the wind blew through was breathtaking, and the quiet night was endlessly quiet. The mulberry trees and the moth larvae that accompanied them were the most famous specialties of this planet, apart from the natural scenery and the newly built universities in the various states. Many years ago, the silk spat out by the larvae of these moth larvae became the most beloved luxury of the empire's nobles. What was very strange was that, apart from the Liban planet, there were countless planets in the empire that were completely suitable for these delicate larvae. The unusually expensive silk entered the Federation along with some great collision in the universe. For decades, the only goods that were qualified to take the risk and enter Bermuda with the Royal Special Forces mecha warriors was silk. The Empire used this smuggling to seize a large amount of wealth from Bermuda and the upper echelons of the Federation. Although this wealth was far from enough to offset the Empire's military expenditure, perhaps because of some emotional and childish considerations, what we have, you don't, you have to wait for us to provide, so we are superior to you. The Empire's royal family had always condoned and even strongly supported the silk smuggling. The Federation had tried to win this childish dispute, but the strictest wildlife protection laws and the HTD Bureau officials who liked to wear iron masks in public prevented the Federation from planting mulberry trees and using warm water to cook the white silk balls woven by the larvae. The Federal Academy of Science had also tried to use biological methods to restructure, but without the technical support of the Bureau of Proclamation in terms of biological proteins, they found that this attempt would cost a lot of money, so they had to stop the plan and continue to buy silk underwear, silk quilts, silk bras, silk chest pads, and everything that was made of silk and hidden in private places. Two skinny young tourists were walking on a street in the southern district of Planet Liban. The silk clothes they were wearing were not particularly eye-catching, but compared to the local residents, it was easy to expose their identity as tourists. However, there were too many tourists on Planet Liban these past few years, and these two people with ordinary faces would not attract much attention. In addition to the hundreds of well-trained professional soldiers in the 4 blocks around them, the soldiers in charge of secret security were watching the two people's every move with a heavy expression, vigilantly watching the wind and grass in the surroundings. These two young tourists did not look like close friends who were traveling together, because when one of them coughed uncontrollably and closed his eyes to fight back tears, the other did not show any concern at all. He continued to walk indifferently, his slightly narrowed eyes full of coldness. Sulu felt that his lungs were full of hot smoke, and his throat was full of red-hot gravel. It was extremely difficult to cough, and it was very uncomfortable. Half squatting on the ground, he breathed rapidly for a long time before finally calming down the pain in his chest and abdomen. He forced himself to stand up. The wound on his shoulder had temporarily stopped bleeding, but the strange power that the Imperial officer had wedged into his body was still tormenting him incessantly, preventing him from using his power to heal his body. Like a slowly rotating rock, it kept grinding and grinding, trying to grind all of his hopes into pieces. It was very strange. After coming to this strange Imperial planet from the Red Rose Royal spaceship, he still did not die, nor was he thrown into the dark prison where he could not see the light of day. Instead, he was temporarily free from the cruel water torture that made people wish they were dead. He began to follow the young Imperial officer and enjoy the scenery on this beautiful planet. In a few short days, he stood on the spaceship and looked down at the magnificent Crimson Mountains in the Western Hemisphere. Those waves that were nearly 100 meters high were as thick as blood, and they swayed his hard heart up and down. He wore a breathing device that was specially used by the Imperial military, and he climbed through the fog in the depths of Pine Cone Ridge for an entire night with difficulty before he finally broke through the fog. He stood on the ridge and saw the first ray of morning light. The damp morning dew moistened his painful lungs and made him feel slightly comfortable. He even tied a small jet device to his back and flew like a natural bird among the indescribably steep stone peaks of Yellowstone. During the Thai dynasty, prisoners would always have a good meal and drink before they died. Now that he was in the Empire, although it was also an imperial society, Sulu did not think that these were the benefits before he died. It was too ridiculous. He stroked his chest that seemed to have been cut by a spear tip, shook his head and exhaled. He stood up and looked at the young imperial officer who had already left more than 10 meters away. He stretched out his hands and rubbed his somewhat stiff face until a few traces of indifferent smile appeared on his face. Only then did he chase after him with big strides. On the street, a brown-haired man with messy hair was holding a little girl's hand and saying something. They were probably father and daughter because they both had a pair of beautiful sky-blue eyes, and the curve of their jawline seemed to have been carved by the same sculptor. However, for some reason, they were arguing. Some of the tattered clothes were wrinkled and torn by the big hand and the little hand. The little girl was crying. On the right side of the back wall of a restaurant, a black dog was running quickly. Its sharp mouth held a simple and honest bone. The black dog was running very resolutely and its goal was very clear. It bypassed the beggar who was lying in the shadows and lifting his lapel to check for his next meal. It jumped over half of the broken wall and ran towards the mulberry forest in the suburbs. It was silent all the way. It probably also knew that if it shouted happily, the food would fall. At the turn of the road in front, a person who looked like a boss wearing silk clothes was talking to a farmer. The reason why he was talking to the farmer was because the farmer with a box under his arm was getting lower and lower as he spoke. It seemed like he was about to kneel. Beside the two people, the listless middle-aged man should be a soldier. The tourist further in front was also a soldier. The driver of the carriage that had been following behind them for half an hour was also a soldier. This seemingly peaceful street was filled with their people. Sulu walked behind the young military officer of the Empire. He walked silently and observed the surroundings. If he didn't know what the people of the Empire were thinking, then he shouldn't think about it anymore. His best ability was to simplify complicated things. He simply thought of himself as a real tourist. It was rare for him to go deep into the territory of the Empire. Looking at this strange world, listening to the strange language of the people in the streets and alleys, and looking at the animal-drawn cars that surprised him, he vaguely understood why the uncle said that he was willing to wander in the universe. However, he still couldn't clearly explain this feeling. In front of a vast sea of green mulberry trees, Wai Chowshire stopped and slowly put his hands behind his back like an old man. His cheeks were slightly raised, and he narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath of fresh air. Where his eyes fell, the leaves of the mulberry trees were gently swaying in the wind. It seemed that he could hear the rustling sound with his sight without his ears. Rustle, rustle, rustle. It was the sound of mulberry leaves being blown by the wind, and it was also the sound of silkworms nibbling on them. A gentle smile suddenly appeared on the face of the young man with the noblest status in the Empire, which had never changed. He seemed to have thought of some interesting childhood memories. His smile gradually disappeared. Wai Chowshire only allowed the memories to occasionally flood into his mind. Occasionally, he would be moved by the four seasons, but he would immediately return to absolute calmness. Although I really don't understand, I still have to thank you for taking me to see so many beautiful sceneries. Sulu coughed twice and looked at the sea of mulberry trees in front of him in surprise. Right now, he was standing side by side with Wai Chowshire. He didn't have the consciousness of a condemned prisoner at all, and he didn't notice the anger in the eyes of the plainclothes soldiers around him. Wai Chowshire glanced at him coldly from the corner of his eyes. He didn't answer, but a strange light flashed through his eyes. If there were no accidents, this Federation person beside him would be tortured to death after all of his value was squeezed out, unless he agreed to defect. He definitely didn't have any sympathy for this. He was just a little curious about Su Li's current behavior. The flames of war continued for decades. The Empire had captured many Federation soldiers and even high-ranking officers. Among the Federation soldiers who knew that they were going to die, some passionately scolded the Empire's emperor, some cowardly cried and knelt on the ground to beg for their lives, some remained silent, and some pretended not to care. However, there were very few like this person who could actually immerse himself in the scenery in front of him before his death. The Red Rose was temporarily resting, and Huai Chao-shi was like a tourist hiding in the Liban Star. He wasn't in a hurry to return to Tianjing Star because the political situation in the empire had been surging with hidden waves recently. He needed to be outside the situation and help his father see the situation clearly. Furthermore, as the person involved, if he returned to Tianjing Star a day later, it would be helpful for his father to deal with the situation. As for why he brought Su Lu along for sightseeing, there were two very simple reasons. One of them was that a dangerous person like Su Lu would not find any chance to escape only if he personally watched over him. I've checked your details. You seem to be a person with perfect morals, an existence similar to a saint. Huai Chao-shi said with slight sarcasm, "Don't be in a hurry to reject me. Your government has been building you up according to a saint." Huai Chao-shi slowly took a few steps forward, then turned around on the mound and looked down at him. "I really want to know if you are really a saint. Would you feel ashamed because of the morals in your heart? Would you recognize your sins before you die?" Sins. I'm not a person with perfect morals. When I was young, I also peeked under the skirts of female police officers. However, when it comes to sins, other than some innocent people that I accidentally killed, I would recognize them. However, Su Lu replied, "This definitely doesn't include people from the Empire." Huai Chao-shi was expressionless and suddenly asked, "What do you think of the Empire's scenery?" "It's very beautiful and spectacular," Su Lu replied honestly. "You tried to invade our country and turned these beautiful scenery into a hell of war. As a Federation soldier, shouldn't you feel guilty?" Chapter 590. Standing on a gentle slope by the sea of mulberry trees, Su Li's thick, ink-like eyebrows seemed to be about to twitch when he heard the young imperial officer's question. However, he eventually calmed down amidst a series of hurried coughs. Decades have already passed. There's not much meaning in arguing about who started the war. Su Lu rubbed the itchy wound on his shoulder through his silk shirt and suddenly said, "But if I remember correctly, it was you who insidiously blew up the Federation's research spaceship. Regarding who started this bloody and long-lasting war in the universe and who should bear the responsibility of opening the Devil's Box, both the Federation and the Empire had their own firm narratives. Due to the distance between the two star systems, the flames of war raged, and the isolation of communication, there were no overly lively academic wars." Huai Chao-shi looked at him coldly and unexpectedly did not express her opinion. Instead, she walked down the slope with her back to Shanghai and headed into the city. Su Lu looked at the sea of green mulberry trees with some reluctance. Listening to the graceful rustling sounds, he turned around and followed her. Huai Chao-shi then went to a few other places. During this process, he remained silent. Su Lu knew the identity of this young imperial officer. Although he had some guesses in his heart, he lacked sufficient evidence. However, he could already guess that this person's status in the Empire was rather high. Therefore, he did not understand why this person wanted to bring him, a prisoner who was destined to die, to continue this absurd sightseeing tour. Could it be that the Empire really wanted a hero created by the Federation to admit to the sins of the Federation in front of the entire universe? This kind of speculation did not make any sense. If Su Lu knew of some of the changes in the Empire's political scene, if this imperial officer was really the legendary figure he had guessed, perhaps he could understand why the other party was deliberately delaying the date of his return to Tianjing. In the afternoon, two skinny young men and over 100 disguised plainclothes soldiers formed a strange visiting team, arriving at Liban Star's Sangji State University. According to the special decree of the Emperor, Liban Star became the only administrative planet in the Empire that implemented indiscriminate education. That is to say, on this planet, no matter if you are a noble or a commoner, or even a serf at the lowest level, as long as your children work hard enough and are outstanding enough, you can get a fair opportunity for education. Even the most outstanding people can get special scholarships provided by the imperial family. This plan was called the Interracial Education Pilot Program. As soon as it was launched, it attracted the angry opposition of the entire noble class of the empire. Every time they thought about how they were the 38th generation heir of a certain glorious family and had to learn in the same classroom as the son of a certain bumpkin, the nobles of the empire felt that they smelled something fishy and felt that their dignity had been greatly humiliated. As nobles, how could they live with those commoners and even slaves? In this matter, the emperor, who had always appeased the nobles in a gentle way and suppressed the lowly commoners in a bloody way, showed a surprising persistence and strength. Under the strong suppression of the emperor, the nobles of the empire's council of elders looked at the soldiers and the officials of the Imperial Intelligence Agency at the gate, and only then did they swallow their anger and pass the law, confirming Liban Star as the Interracial Education Pilot Program area. Even so, when the son of the first serf walked through the gate of Liban Star's Yellow Mountain Academy with a face full of nervousness and fear, he still needed the protection of the armed soldiers of the empire. On that day, the principal of the Yellow Mountain G Academy resigned in anger. In the following year, the nobles of the Liban Star sent their offspring to other planets. They would rather spend a huge amount of wealth so that their children could receive a pure aristocratic education, rather than endure the abominable actions of the emperor on the Liban Star. For the continuous wealth of their territories, these nobles would certainly not leave Liban Star, but this could not change a certain trend. As more and more commoners entered the new universities, the atmosphere of the planet became more and more active, or more dangerous. Of course, these young people, who had become more capable and confident because of their exposure to more knowledge, were incomparably loyal and fanatical to His Majesty, who had bestowed upon them all. In the center of the first floor of the largest building in Sangji State University, hung a huge portrait of His Majesty, Huai Fu Chai. Every time a student passed by, they would immediately stop their fierce academic debate and stand at attention with a solemn expression on their faces. Sulu withdrew his gaze from the portrait and listened to the quarrel behind him. He could not help but frown slightly. His empire's language was not good, so he could barely hear that the students seemed to be discussing the control of engine output power. The extent of the discussion was relatively shallow, but he still felt a strong sense of vigilance. It should be known that when he was in the Federation, no one would have thought that in the Empire University, there would be so many commoner students discussing academic issues in a relaxed atmosphere. He had always believed that the Federation's greatest advantage over the Empire was not in terms of economy, but in terms of education, technology, and the most fundamental way of thinking. Now that the Empire seemed to be quietly making changes, with the Empire's terrifying population base, it might not be too difficult to catch up to this gap. Huai Chaosher noticed him and frowned. She maintained her expressionless silence and led him to the third floor. In the conference room at the top of the third floor, there was a history class going on. Hundreds of plainly dressed Empire youths were quietly and eagerly listening to the professor on the podium. The courseware playback equipment, the line-by-line scanning light filter screen, the old-fashioned laser stylus, all of these were somewhat shabby in Su Li's eyes. Not to mention the first military academy or Yue University, even compared to the university conditions in his hometown of Donglin, the Empire was far behind. But he listened very carefully, because the professor from the Empire was emotionally lecturing about the cause of the war many years ago. The professor used the standard language of the Empire's nobles, and he could barely understand most of it. The history professor of Mulberry State University did not know that there were two special young listeners in the crowd listening to the lecture today. He did not expect that the history he was lecturing at this moment would have any impact on the future history. He was only using the standard teaching materials of the Empire's Royal Education Department to describe the cruelty and treachery of the people of the Federation to the youths of the Empire. For a shameless coalition of politicians like the Federation controlled by businessmen, what could make them spend a huge amount of military funds to start a long-term war? The glory of the country. No, they never know how to write the word glory. The professor waved the laser stylus on his finger excitedly. The red light dots danced quickly on the ceiling of the conference room, just like the heroic dance of the most common butterfly on this planet before its death. Its benefits. Only benefits can make this coalition of businessmen crazy. Its crystal mines. Only crystal mines can sustain their limitless expansion of the star domain, and thus alleviate the deep internal conflicts. 200 years ago, the Federation's crystal mines were already close to exhaustion. There were only two paths placed before them. The first was to find or invent a new type of energy source as soon as possible, and the second was to immediately find new crystal mines. Otherwise, their spaceships that used crystal mines as a foundation would all be paralyzed, and their space weapons would all become ineffective. In other words, the Federation could collapse at any time. However, the Federation's people spent more than 100 years, yet they still couldn't find new crystal mines. All of this time that could have been used to develop new energy sources was also completely wasted. Why? Because one of the families of businessmen who controlled the Federation's political power had the legal right to exploit crystal mines, and through this authority, they obtained a large amount of benefits. If the Federation developed a new type of energy source, this family's special status would be completely gone. There was no way they would allow this type of situation to happen. Why would the Federation's government allow this type of thing to happen? Because you all must never forget that the government is actually controlled by these families. The Federation doesn't have crystal mines, but the Empire does. When those supposedly cursed Federation exploration spaceships accidentally entered the Empire and discovered this fact, war was no longer avoidable. Bandits came to our doorstep. They don't need a reason to rob, so what we must do, is also very simple. The history professor no longer had his initial calm. Clenching his fists tightly, he said angrily, "Beat these bandits to death." Sulu had no doubt that if his identity as a member of the Federation was discovered, he would definitely be torn to pieces by the several hundred angry Empire students in the conference room in the next moment. Fortunately, his black hair and black eyes were the same as those of the Empire officer beside him. Although they were somewhat eye-catching, they only attracted slightly respectful gazes. After listening to this history class, Sulu followed the other out of the campus. Outside the door, he was silent for a moment, and then he made a rare request. He asked for a cigarette. Amidst the waves of smoke, he said to the Empire officer, "This is very similar to our history class. In the history books I've read about this period, it says that the Empire's emperor brazenly launched a war in order to alleviate the racial and class conflicts within your country." Silence and cigarettes were good companions for thinking. The reason he was thinking was because Sulu had to admit that this Empire's history class, for him, was indeed a different angle to look at the origins of the war back then. This was especially the case regarding crystal mines leading to the war. This was the first time he had heard of this. The family that could control the government was naturally the Thai family in the back of the mountain behind Macho. Chapter 591. Those trashy officials in the bureau. Huai Chaoshi was not in a good mood. The Federation soldier named Sulu in front of him was completely different from the description in the intelligence. He was tough, but he was not the pedantic saint who truly carried the banner of morality in his heart. He had never believed that such a person existed in the universe, and now it seemed that it was indeed so. If Sulu was really a freak saint, perhaps the actions of the Empire in the past few days could have really touched him. To be able to make the war hero that the Federation had spent the most effort to cultivate betray, no, even if it was just to make him doubt himself from the depths of his heart, it would definitely be of great help to the Empire's propaganda and this war. Was it a pity? A little, but it was nothing too pitiful. It was just that there would be another dead body of the Federation in the Empire's territory. In the face of death, many people of the Federation would kneel and beg for mercy, but I've studied you and know that the possibility is not high. The reason why I brought you to see the scenery and let you listen to this specially arranged history lesson is to strike a blow to the moral superiority of you hypocrites of the Federation. Huai Chaoshi walked out of the campus with his hands behind his back like an old man. His face was expressionless, hiding the pity deep in his heart extremely well. Moral superiority is indeed a very boring thing. Su Lo replied, but I am really interested in this period of history. Before I die, can you satisfy my request and let me see the relevant files of the past? If you want to strike a blow to the moral superiority of the Federation people, this is very necessary. Huai Chaoshi was silent for a moment and nodded. His subordinates disguised as civilians in the crowd behind him immediately left to arrange this matter. The Empire's history textbook was translated into the Federation's language. It took 1 hour and 17 minutes, showing extremely high efficiency. An hour and a half later, Su Lu moved his eyes away from the e-book screen and rubbed his pale face due to weakness. He suddenly opened his mouth and asked, according to your logic, this is the Federation's scheme. But in reality, the previous war, the first space war that you mentioned, we had already prepared for it. If we really had a conspiracy, why would we appear so unprepared? According to the records of the Empire's history books, the Empire had always been cautious when they first came into contact with the Federation. They would never think of attacking the scientific research ships of the Federation. In their opinion, the explosion of the scientific research spaceship was definitely a scheme of the Federation. They even provided relevant evidence to prove that the spaceship could only have been blown up by the Federation themselves. Because in the eyes of the Federation, we are just a bunch of monkeys with outdated technology. Huai Chaoshi coldly replied, you guys are too impatient and underestimate the monkey's ability to resist. It was strange to say that Su Luk should have been enduring endless torture in the Empire's black prison, just like what he had experienced in the past 10 days. However, at this moment, he was in the highest class club on planet Libin, having lunch with what was definitely the most respected figure of the Empire. This was a high-rise building in the shape of a deformed mulberry tree. It sparkled under the sunlight. The restaurant on the top floor that had long been cleared was empty. Looking around, one could clearly see the sea of mulberry trees beneath their feet like a green carpet. That's all for the discussion of history. The beginning of a story does not determine the color of the entire story. Even if it is a war related to profit, it is not beyond the scope of my poor thinking. However, in the end, in my opinion, you are a group of beasts that slaughter civilians, women, and babies. This is something that cannot be changed. Su Luk picked up the knife and fork and began to cut the beef on the plate. His trembling right hand that held the knife showed his current weakness. He lowered his head and asked, because of certain reasons, you temporarily did not kill me. I can understand. However, I still do not understand why you are willing to grant me such enjoyment. The you in the intelligence report does appear to be somewhat stupid and absurd in certain matters. However, someone who can develop the MX mecha must have enough wisdom to understand certain facts. Huai Chaoshi gently wiped the corner of his mouth and indifferently said, as long as you do not work wholeheartedly for the Empire, then no matter what, no matter sooner or later, you will die in the end. At this point, this special young Imperial officer emphasized, but you only need to give me a satisfactory answer to 2 things. I can guarantee that you will die with great dignity. And I think that this answer should not harm the interests of your government. What is it? The first question, you are not Li Pifu's illegitimate child. How did you manage to cultivate Yadajinchi? White Xiaoshu's eyes flashed with a trace of biting cold. Yada Xinqi. Su Lu confirmed that this was the first time he had heard of this strange term. What was Yada? What was Xinqi? Was it a wonderful setting in one of Master Schiller's plays? However, it seemed that the scorching heat in his body was very similar to the setting in the Master's plays. Huai Xiaoshu did not mind his silence and continued calmly, the second question. This time, you passed through the space channel and ambushed the ghost fleet. You are infinitely close to success. It could even be said that you have succeeded. I cannot understand. How did you manage to follow us in the Empire's star sector by controlling a light tri-winged warship? At this point, he waved his hand. The subordinate who had been waiting in the distance hurriedly ran over and set up the relevant equipment by the table. With a light beeping sound, countless fine beams of light shot out from the equipment and gathered into dense light spots in the air, forming a three-dimensional star map of the Empire's border star sector. Even if you have the star map drawn by the Federation years ago in your hands, you can't do this alone. White Xiaoshu's slender finger drew on the imaginary three-dimensional star map in the air and pointed at the obvious sailing trajectory. Frowning, he said, "Your sailing route was too perfect. Even if I had thought more thoroughly, assuming that you had the authorization of the Bureau of Proclamation before the crazy revenge operation, with the remote support of the charter computer, it would not have been enough to complete such massive calculations. Besides, every time your tri-winged warship accelerated or hid, it just happened to avoid the detection range of the fleet. How did you do it?" He looked at Su Li's eyes and asked solemnly, "According to the intelligence, you don't know how to pilot a warship at all." Su Lu was silent. The first question involved the uncle, who was known as the #1 traitor of the Federation. Who knew what kind of relationship he had with the Imperium? Also, this story involved the loophole of the Federation's The Glory of the Charter and his last hope of survival. Naturally, it was impossible for him to tell the other party. As for the second question, it was related to his greatest secret, so it was even more impossible for him to tell. Therefore, he could only remain silent. Huai Xiaoshu raised his extremely ordinary face and said indifferently, "I won't ask you to reveal the Federation's newest technological secrets. I just need a general answer." A moment later, Su Lu replied, "I can't tell you anything. I can only say that this revenge plan that seems impulsive is actually not impulsive at all. It's just that I didn't expect you to be on that flagship. If I hadn't met you, I would have successfully returned to the Federation by now." Still not getting an answer, Huai Xiaoshu narrowed his eyes, and a dangerous aura gradually enveloped the dining table. "There's good news. The Imperium has already successfully developed a high-power dedicated signal output device. In the last experiment, it has already successfully connected to your civilian network." Huai Xiaoshu looked at Su Lu with narrowed eyes and said slowly, "The video that humiliates the Federation's war hero will probably be the first document we send over." Su Li's right hand that was holding the knife suddenly tightened. He knew that the humiliation the other was talking about was definitely a humiliation that ordinary people would find difficult to endure. What truly made him nervous was the Empire's following arrangements. He wasn't a narcissistic person, but he had to admit that he was now important enough to be able to affect even more people and matters, and on a much larger scale. The Federation government had spent a huge amount of money to film and broadcast the documentary, Team 7. Together with the media that covered everything, it was only then that he and his troops were molded into a brand new military idol. If that video that hadn't appeared yet was widely spread through the civilian network, it would undoubtedly be a heavy blow to the Federation's public and the military's morale. If such a situation really did occur, the Federation government would definitely hope that this Federation hero would simply die in battle rather than be captured and humiliated by the Empire's people. Su Lu also thought the same. This is very interesting. It's just like playing cards. We killed Zhong Suehu, which is a trump card. You chased after us and killed Keaton, which can be considered as returning a hard card. Then I captured you, the successor of the war god. I'm very curious as to what kind of trump card the Federation can return. Whitesaucher's tone didn't contain any deliberate mockery. He raised an exquisite silver fork and sent a piece of tender beef into his mouth, slowly chewing. Why isn't it a live broadcast of me being killed? Letting the entire universe watch you die, other than stimulating the Federation's desire to fight and calming your internal conflicts, what good does it do for the Empire? I can let myself die, Sulu said with a serious tone. The department I'm in has a lot of drugs that can be used. Whitesaucher frowned, picked up an exquisite white porcelain salt jar, and lightly sprinkled some salt on the steak. Also, I understand people like you very well. You are not afraid of death, but before death truly arrives, you will stubbornly want to live on. You have strong confidence that you can live on. Therefore, unless you are certain that you will definitely die, you will never commit suicide. Sulu blinked, feeling that his eyes were a bit dry. Only now did he realize that this seemingly ordinary young officer of the Empire in front of him not only had inexplicably powerful combat strength, but also had an extremely strong ability to read people's minds and to coerce them with force. The dining table was silent. Only the sound of the silver knife and fork lightly touching the porcelain plate, and the juicy and tender sirloin touching the tongue and teeth could be heard. Whitesaucher was waiting for Sulu to make a decision and give an answer. Sulu knew that he wouldn't give any answer. He was like he was in a bottomless dry well, looking at the trace of light that perhaps didn't exist. He was unwilling to fall into eternal darkness, but he couldn't find any solution. Right at this time, an Empire officer walked into the dining room with a serious expression, holding an electronic spectrum record book in his hand. Whitesaucher narrowed his eyes and looked up. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked up. Chapter 592. Whitesaucher narrowed her eyes and looked up. Sulu looked up and narrowed his eyes. During the past few days of sightseeing, the Imperial soldiers who appeared in the open with the two of them were all wearing plain clothes. This was the first time he had seen someone wearing a military uniform, and he immediately thought that this officer should be a member of the security department hidden in the dark. Sir, there is indeed a problem with the intelligence feedback received last night. The Imperial officer stood beside Whitesaucher and reported respectfully and concisely, we have increased the surveillance. Just now, the electrical detection room detected a low-energy waveform curve. It seems to be a civil electrical appliance, but the curve is a bit strange, and the spectrum exclusion is unable to obtain a result. Whitesaucher frowned slightly and took the spectrum analysis electronic manual. Looking at the quivering curve on the top, she asked, weapon. Military and civil mecha heat start has been excluded, and the reference frequency of long-range weapons is also different. Analysis is being conducted. It should be safe, but the location of this restaurant is too exposed, so please leave immediately. The Imperial officer said directly, and he had no intention of avoiding Sulu at all. Although he, like many of his colleagues, did not understand why the Honorable Sir would bring this lowly Federation captive with her, in their eyes, this person was already a dead man, and it did not matter even if they heard some confidential information. Whitesaucher looked at the curve on the electronic manual, and the angle of her thin and black eyebrows furrowed a little wider. She was a little self-deprecating in doubt. Was there anyone in the Empire who dared to harm her? Sulu heard the Imperial officer's conversation, but his pair of black eyebrows did not helplessly furrow into a ball, but suddenly raised like a knife because he saw a very familiar curve in the corner of his eyes. His pupils suddenly constricted and brightened. He felt a chill coming from his neck, causing the hair on that area to stand on end. This was indeed not the heat start waveform curve of a mecha, nor was it the warm-up curve of a fighter jet. In fact, the entire surveillance department of the Empire should not have seen this curve, and there were very few people in the Federation who had seen this curve. But he had seen it before. In the glacier of 5460, Qinghai, he and Gu Shifeng had discussed many times what electronic means should be used to destroy this terrifying weapon's only flaw that not many people had discovered. But because of the tight time, he and Gu Shifeng only found a direction, but did not succeed in putting it into practice. It was ACW. This curve was the redundant overflow waveform created by the activation of the ACW electric pulse ignition device and the magnetic resonance auxiliary effect. It sounded ridiculous that a gun could actually alarm an electronic monitoring device, but when it was placed on this big gun that gathered the wisdom of countless weapons experts in the Federation, and was so expensive that the former Minister of Defense cursed for 3 days straight, it seemed reasonable. When this terrifyingly powerful king of single guns first appeared on the Chiolin slope outside the S2 Foundation building, it blasted apart Macklin's well-trained subordinates and powerful Special Task Force agents. When it reappeared in the snowy world at the front lines of the West Woods, it was like a ghost that took the lives of more than a dozen high-ranking Imperial officers in succession. In the entire Federation, only 3 ACWs had ever been produced, and one of them had always been in the hands of his best friend, Qinghai. Therefore, he knew better than anyone else just how terrifying this great gun was. Due to the scarcity of manufacturing costs and materials, on the battlefield, the ACW was an extremely poor sniper rifle. However, if it was used for assassination, it was definitely the most despairing choice. There was a slight breeze of fresh air in the restaurant on the top floor, but the little goosebumps on the back of Su Li's neck were about to freeze. Where was that sniper? The ring-shaped restaurant surrounded by transparent glass was empty, and there was only a mountain ridge in the distance that looked like a black line. He should be there. Who was the sniper's target? Him. But if the Imperial people wanted to kill him now, it would be too easy. Why would they go through so much trouble? And it was obvious that the young and noble Imperial officer across the table did not know about this matter, let alone that there would be 3 high-speed tungsten alloy bullets flying towards him. Could it be that the sniper's target was the other party? In certain dangerous moments, the speed of human thought could even appear faster than the speed of light. In a very short period of time, Su Lo thought and analyzed many things, but he still did not have time to judge the situation clearly, and he also knew that there was no time to continue thinking. No matter who the sniper's target was, the only thing he had to do now was to fall down as fast as he could and look for something hard enough to cover his body. With a whoosh, the silver knife, fork, and white bone porcelain tableware splashed everywhere with Su Li's movements. He was not a saint, and he did not care about the life or death of the Imperial officer across the table, so naturally he would not stupidly jump over to the other party. He just fell down, resolutely and fiercely, as if he was heavily shot down by someone. His body was almost close to the ground. The silver knife, fork, and white bone porcelain tableware had just jumped off the beautiful stone table, twisting their bodies in the air. The Imperial officer who came to report the situation opened his mouth, but he did not have time to show a vigilant expression. The words that he wanted to shout were still brewing in his chest and lungs, but they had not turned into airflow, and he had not strummed his strings like vocal cords. In this frozen moment of time that seemed to have stopped, White Saoshir's eyes suddenly lit up. He understood something from Su Li's movements, feeling an unprecedented sense of danger approaching him at high speed. There was no time to jump up, no time to fall down. In front of that bullet that was tearing through the bright air of Mulberry Orchid Province at high speed, even someone as powerful as White Saoshir did not have time to make too many movements. He only had time to raise his right palm, and as if he was swatting away the beef juice in front of him, he simply slapped down on the beautiful stone table in front of him. No one could calculate what kind of terrifying reaction speed White Saoshir needed to make such a simple movement in this instant. When his right palm slapped down on the edge of the beautiful stone table, the beautiful stone pattern that was known as the hardest stone material actually deformed slightly. His palm's deformation was even more severe. The pale white part of his palm that was in contact with the edge of the table squeezed out a rosy red, and also strangely squeezed out countless jets of air. The 8 rice shinchi in White Sausher's body was released at full force. The silk sleeve on his right arm shattered into pieces, about to fly away. The chair beneath him silently shattered, about to fall. His body, under the influence of this powerful and tremendous force, instantly began to move backwards. A flower suddenly bloomed on the hard wall of the ring-shaped restaurant. The petals were pieces of concrete that had been blasted open. The core of the flower was alloy tendons that stood up like angry hairs after being cut open by a high-speed object. The color of the flower was light, the heavenly light that seeped in from outside the wall. The light outside the building shot in through this flower-like hole. While moving forward, it lightly brushed past White Chowsher, who was moving backwards at high speed like a shadow. Then, there was a loud buzzing noise that sounded like muffled thunder. The speed of this life-reaping bullet was too fast, faster than sound, as if it was going to surpass light and shadow. In an instant, 2 more holes that seemed to have been carved appeared on the wall. The muffled sound of gunfire tore through the deathly silence, shattering the frozen time. With a muffled bang sound, White Sausher's thin body fell heavily against the wall. Her Highness is under attack. The Empire officer who had been watching this scene in shock finally woke up. His entire body trembled as he screamed out. At the same time, he threw himself towards the corner of the wall, instinctively placing his body in front of White Chowsher. The life-reaping bullets that came from the distant mountain ridge were still being fired continuously. The luxurious decorations in the restaurant were torn apart like fragile pieces of paper. They floated up, landed on the ground with difficulty, and were sent flying again. The sound of broken porcelain and silver tableware rang out endlessly. Smoke and dust flew everywhere. It was chaos. Su Lo hid behind the hard and beautiful carved stone tabletop. His face was a bit pale. At this moment, he confirmed that the sniper's target wasn't him, but he didn't relax in the slightest. This was because he discovered that the ACW used by the sniper was a high-speed armor-piercing hard-ink bullet. Moreover, after the first 3 burst shots, the sniper began to fire in a wide range. It looked like the sniper didn't care about killing him while he was at it. The high-speed armor-piercing hard-ink bullet could penetrate the normal alloy plates of military mecha. How could the supposedly hardest carved stone tabletop in front of him block it? The next second, Su Lo was slightly relieved. This was because the Empire's soldiers in the restaurant reacted extremely quickly. The ring-shaped glass adjusted the angle of light refraction in the shortest amount of time possible. Although this definitely couldn't block the sniper's bullet, it could make it a little more difficult for the opponent to shoot. Immediately after, even more Empire soldiers flooded into the spacious restaurant. These soldiers seemed to not be able to see the mournful lines of bullets. They carried the pop-up alloy shields and bravely charged towards the corner of the wall. 4 or 5 Empire soldiers fell on the road, but in the end, they still managed to successfully construct a simple shielding corner. Su Lo didn't expect those Empire soldiers to provide him with the same treatment. In fact, he thought that this was a good opportunity for him. Under the cover of the smoke and dust, he half lay on the ground, using his heels to rub against the mess on the ground, quietly and slowly moving backwards. Ox. Right at this moment, in the corner surrounded by the Empire soldiers' alloy shields, a loud Empire language suddenly rang out. At this moment, this voice still sounded extremely calm and powerful. It was actually not drowned out by the whistling sound of bullets tearing through the air. Su Lo could understand some of the Empire language. At the very least, he could accurately understand this sentence. Keep an eye on that Federation person. He stopped his slow retreat, frowned, and cursed fiercely in his heart. He didn't expect that in such a tense moment, that person still hadn't forgotten about him. That sniper actually didn't kill this person who was clearly the strongest enemy of the Federation. This made him feel a little regretful. The gunshots suddenly stopped. In the silence, there was a sudden vibration. The floor-to-ceiling windows that were already shattered beyond repair began to buzz. Sulu, who was hiding behind the table and covered in dust, and Huai Chaoshi, who was anxiously surrounded by his subordinates and half covered in blood, couldn't see each other, but they did the same action at the same time. They narrowed their eyes, raised their heads, and cursed in a low voice, "Fuck." There was a wisp of cloud outside the building. A dark green Empire fighter suddenly broke through the cloud and rushed over at high speed. What was even more terrifying was that the missiles under the wings of the fighter had already been detached and were spitting flames high in the sky. Chapter 593. Did he always see something inauspicious every time he raised his head and narrowed his eyes? Su Li's eyes were wide open as he stared at the rapidly approaching aircraft in the air outside the building, as well as the 4 dazzling missile jet streams that filled his nose with the smell of death. In the Federation's understanding, the Imperial family should be a supreme existence in their star field, an existence that no one dared to look down upon. But how could there be someone who dared to assassinate that young Imperial officer? They even sent out fighter jets. Death was about to arrive in an instant, but Sulu was still unwilling to give up. He hurriedly breathed in the air mixed with smoke and dust as he ran a few steps toward the corner of the building. The beam structure of the building there should be able to increase the chances of survival after the building collapsed. Even if it only increased the chances of survival from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 1,000, the chances were still higher. Whoosh! 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 Countless densely packed sounds rang out as hundreds of white streams of air rose from below the high-rise building where the restaurant was located. They quickly swept past the ring-shaped glass window and then abruptly turned, heading toward the 4 missiles. The Imperial Defensive Bomb Cluster Formation. Right before the explosion, Sulu recognized these things. In a flash, a thought appeared in his mind. To have the qualifications to have these battlefield weapons protect the team, the identity of the young officer should not be far from what he had guessed. The rapidly rising dense bomb cluster successfully intercepted 3 extremely powerful missiles in the shortest amount of time, but missed the last one. The violent explosion, the dazzling flames, the flying debris, and the pungent smoke instantly occupied the entire restaurant. A huge hole was blown in the wall in front of the right. The wind from the outside whistled in and was licked by the burning flames. The temperature was boiling hot. The slender and elegant high-rise building shook like a young girl who had been slapped on the back of her head by a naughty boy. However, for the people inside the building, it was like they had experienced a terrifying earthquake. The floor shook violently, and no one could stand still and fell heavily to the ground. As for the soldiers of the Imperium who were close to the center of the explosion, many of them were blown out of the building by the airwaves before they could even make a sound, turning into black spots that rapidly fell from the sky. Some of them crashed into the wall on the opposite side and died while spraying blood. Some of the soldiers were set ablaze, screaming miserably before they fell to the ground and twitched, unable to get up again. Sulu was very lucky. The missile that wasn't intercepted exploded very far away from his body. Other than the rubble that flew up from his brow bone, his body was unscathed. In the corner a few steps away from him, Huai Chaoshi, who was surrounded by the soldiers of the Imperium and their alloy shields like a cocoon, was naturally not dead either. The soldiers in the corner quickly dispersed. Huai Chaoshi stood up with a cold face. Half of his body was dyed red with blood. Combined with the ruthlessness that flashed across his cold face, it made people shudder. In the blink of an eye, the emotions on his face suddenly became abnormally heavy. It was unknown what he had thought of, but this young expert of the Imperium who had remained calm in the face of an assassination attempt, only angry and not frightened, also felt somewhat bewildered and at a loss. However, these emotions were only temporary. Huai Chaoshu coldly glanced at Su Lo, who was not far away, walked over with large strides, grabbed him by the back of the neck, lifted him up, and threw him to a subordinate officer behind him. Then, he quickly left with the crowd. This was a shameful treatment, like catching a chicken. However, Su Lo knew very well that as a prisoner of the Federation, he could not expect to receive true respect. The so-called sightseeing and the so-called imperial cuisine were only because the other party had a request. Right now, the environment was dangerous, so how could the other party still care about psychological attacks? That special Imperium officer was heavily injured, but the movement of his hand reaching out and grabbing was still as strong as before. His palm wasn't large, but it was harder than steel. The blood that flowed down this person's arm turned his shoulder wet and sticky. The Imperium soldiers protected Huai Chaoshu as quickly as possible, pushing and even dragging Su Lo to the bottom of the building. There were already more than 10 bulletproof military vehicles waiting by the side of the street. However, those who dared to carry out this crazy assassination had no intention of letting this group of people leave just like that. The Imperium soldiers in charge of security and surveillance had some ugly expressions on their faces. Just 3 blocks away, there was a mechanized unit approaching at high speed. At this very moment, a mechanized unit without any electronic communication verification represented absolute danger. Meanwhile, the surveillance confirmed that this unit's combat strength was at least greater than that of a reinforced battalion. There was absolutely no way these 100 or so soldiers could contend against them. "Sir, please leave first." The Imperium's military officer in charge of security gave Huai Chaoshu a military salute with a flushed face, and then loudly said to the surrounding soldiers, "Stop them on the spot, immediately set up temporary fortifications." The Imperium soldiers responded in unison, quickly moving into action. They shouted loudly, blowing down the giant electronic signboards on both sides of the street, blocking the center of the street as a fortification to stop the enemy's mechanized vehicles. At the same time, they drove over the military vehicles that they had decided to leave behind, also blocking the street. Even though they knew that this was a mission to stop the enemy, these Imperium soldiers didn't hesitate in the slightest. Their faces didn't show any fear, instead full of valiant fighting spirit. In order to protect the Imperium's pride, their most respected officer, they truly did not fear death. Huai Chaoshu nodded at his subordinates, turned around, and sat on the military vehicle. During this entire process, his face was still cold, not saying a single word. As a soldier, at this very moment, any sadness of parting was a waste of emotion and hypocrisy. Accompanied by the ear-piercing grinding sound of wheels, several military vehicles quickly drove away. Su Lo looked at the young military officer in the front row who could make countless Imperium soldiers willingly give up their lives. His brows furrowed slightly, and he coughed twice. He didn't understand where this person's grave and worried expression came from. This freakish expert who didn't even frown when half of his body was covered in blood, what was he worried about at this time? It shouldn't be that he was worried about the pursuit from behind or the lives of his subordinates. People like him should have long since become indifferent to such things. Suddenly, concentrated gunfire and explosions rang out in the streets behind them. Su Lo turned back to look, only to see flames and smoke rising into the sky. In order to cover for Huai Chaoshu's departure, the Imperium soldiers engaged in fierce and even bloody battles with the enemy in the streets of Mulberry-Ji province. Over 100 soldiers gradually died in silence. Of the several military vehicles that drove away, only 2 were left behind to carry out a desperate suicide attack. Huai Chaoshu's group finally managed to temporarily shake off the pursuit of the enemy and arrived at the outskirts of a quiet residential area. The door to the underground garage slowly opened, and 3 military vehicles filed in. As the door closed once more, no one was able to discover the abnormality of this place. In the dim underground garage, White Sousher's expression was still heavy. He looked at the electronic map and said, "Cut off all contact with the outside world and stay here for 20 minutes to observe the situation." "Yes, sir," a soldier replied. "This is the latest meeting point set up by the Bureau. As long as those traitors are unable to infiltrate the royal palace, they should not be able to find this place." They had some guesses as to who dared to carry out the assassination, but no matter who it was, if they dared to assassinate the emperor, then they were, without a doubt, traitors. White Sousher made a sound of agreement. For him, the most important reason for choosing this meeting point was not because it was hidden, but because it was the source of his confidence in moving unhindered through the universe. The history of the Empire was written with blood. He knew this very well since he was young. However, ever since the Emperor inherited the throne, the Empire and the noble class were unprecedentedly united. At least, it was on the surface. No one dared to challenge the dignity of the royal family, much less carry out such a crazy action. Who dared to assassinate him? White Sousher's expression was unusually heavy. Just as Su Lu had analyzed, he was not worried about his own safety. Instead, he thought that if those people dared to assassinate him, they would definitely know how angry the emperor would be. Then, would the emperor's safety also be threatened at this moment? Suddenly, the alarm rang. The Empire officer looked at the data feedback on the screen with a face full of shock. He said with extreme guilt, "The whistle left outside confirmed that the rebel army suddenly changed direction and is coming this way. Sir, this place should be exposed." As he spoke, the Empire officer's hand was on the gun at his waist. He swept his cold gaze over the people present, trying to find the traitor hiding among his own people. "Don't move." An officer at the front right suddenly took out a metal gun from behind him and shouted at the crowd, "Otherwise, I will immediately kill the emperor." The cold gun barrel trembled slightly as it aimed at White Sousher. The officer's voice was also trembling. It was obvious how much pressure he was under at this moment. "Rossi, you traitor, put down the gun. Otherwise, I will kill you." The Empire officer from before roared angrily. He wanted to rush forward and use his chest to block the muzzle of the gun, but because he was afraid that the opponent's bullet would hurt the emperor, he did not dare to move. "Our people will be here soon." The Empire officer named Rossi laughed somewhat crazily and said in a shrill voice, "When the time comes, I will kill all of you." "Rossi, why is this? Have you forgotten the kindness that the Emperor has shown you?" White Sousher looked at this subordinate officer expressionlessly. He could no longer remember when this officer had entered the bureau to work, and when he had become his direct subordinate. He did not listen to the angry questioning of his loyal subordinate. He did not even look at the trembling gun barrel. Instead, he took a step forward without any warning. Half of his body was covered in blood. It was as if he was stepping on the wind. In an instant, he moved forward 2 meters. He slapped down with his palm, bending the gun barrel and breaking the traitor's neck at the same time. With a crack, the traitor fell to the ground. His head was horribly tilted to the back. Su Lu, who was standing behind the crowd, narrowed his eyes. He was shocked. The emperor was seriously injured, but he was still so strong. Chapter 594. The dark underground parking lot, the dangerous guns, and the escape. This kind of familiar environment made Su Lu feel a little uncomfortable. The internal strife of the Empire had nothing to do with him, a soldier of the Federation. Ever since he entered the underground parking lot, he had been standing silently at the back, watching everything unfold, trying his best to listen to the Empire's language, which was difficult to understand. Assassination, traitor. He felt that the conversation of these Empire people was very much like a clumsy script, but he had never thought that such a clumsy script would have such a seemingly natural, understated, and yet extremely sharp ending. The Empire's soldiers looked at the traitor officer lying in a pool of blood with disdain, walked to the side of the underground parking lot, pulled open the cement wall camouflage outside, and then tore off a large piece of blue electronic dustproof cloth. With a whoosh, a new Empire mecha in black and green revealed its true appearance amidst the flying dust. Its armor glowed with a faint metallic luster, its body slender like a demon, and strange metal boxes hung from each of its joints. Sulu narrowed his eyes, his pupils constricting. This was the peach miasma that had brought him to a dead end. Wai Chaoshi coughed twice and silently boarded the mecha, while the rest of the Empire's soldiers quickly dispersed. All the lights in the underground parking lot suddenly went out, and in the darkness, the low and powerful sound of multiple engines suddenly rang out, cutting through the silence and stifling atmosphere. Just before the rebel army surrounded the street, the peach miasma mecha broke through the door at high speed, turning into a ghostly shadow under the light of day. It crushed the cement road, knocked away the tanks in its path, and roared as it ran away. Its speed was swift, and its momentum was heroic. It did not look like it was fleeing at all, but leaving proudly. And then it threw itself into the sea of mulberry trees. Inside the dimly lit cockpit, only the green sea of mulberry trees on the monitor screen could soothe the nervous nerves and somewhat dry eyes. Those tender twigs and leaves fluttering in the wind flashed past the screen at high speed, gradually becoming countless green lines. It was possible to infer just how astonishing the speed of the mecha was at this moment. Sulu slightly lowered his eyes, no longer looking at the picture of Shanghai on the light beam that lasted for almost half an hour. His eyes fell on the officer of the Imperium next to him cautiously. The person beside him had sustained significant injuries in the attack at the ring-shaped restaurant. Blood had dyed a large portion of his body red, but this person's expression did not change at all. He continued to operate his mecha steadily, skillfully, or even exquisitely, dodging at high speeds through the sea of mulberry trees, avoiding what seemed to be an increasing number of enemies. Could it be that the Imperial family were all monsters with endless blood flowing through their bodies? This should be a nervous escape, but to Sulu, he thought of himself as an outsider, so he had enough calmness to observe everything that was happening. Especially this peach miasma mecha. This was the latest generation of mecha that the Empire had successfully developed. It walked the path of multi-joint microengine acceleration. It was different from the Federation's development of the new mecha, but it was very similar in essence. Sulu had not expected that in such a tense moment, this young Imperial personage would actually bring him along. However, this just so happened to provide him with a rare opportunity to observe the Empire's new mecha up close. He used his eyes to observe all the devices in the cockpit of the mecha, doing his best to memorize everything he saw. Although the chances of him returning to the Federation alive were slim, if he had the chance to send back this first-hand information, it would definitely be of great help to the Federation. Other than the internal structure of the Empire's new mecha, he was more interested in the way this young Imperial officer beside him operated it. After a long period of silent observation, he confirmed that this person's method of operating the mecha was extremely similar to his and Li Feng's. They were also using a device similar to the simulation system, directly transferring the power in their bodies into the internal sensors of the mecha. It was just that the other's device was clearly more compact, with only the connectors at the cuffs of the mecha visible. During their escape in the Mulberry Sea, this Imperial officer had operated the Peach Miasma mecha to easily break through the enemy's encirclement. In several thrilling encounters, he had killed several enemy mecha like a tiger tearing rabbits apart. Sulu had been watching his operation all this time, once again feeling the terror he had personally experienced on the battleship. In the process of breaking through the encirclement, this Imperial officer had displayed an unparalleled level of mecha control. This was especially true of the calm and sharp senses that radiated from his bones, as well as the exquisite micro-operations that danced between his fingers. What looked like the simplest input of commands, the most standard mecha movements, when combined at a certain frequency, would become so powerful. Sometimes, without waking up in the middle of the night, Sulo would privately analyze himself and feel a little satisfied and proud. Other than his talent in mecha maintenance, what he was most proud of was his mecha operation skills. In just a few short years, even if he could not say that he was invincible in the military, at least no one had dared to challenge him. However, after the battle on the battleship today, he could not help but admit with some desolation that this Imperial officer beside him was indeed far more skilled than himself. Admitting that he was inferior to the other did not mean that he would always admit defeat. His personality determined his way of thinking, especially when he thought about how this Imperial officer beside him was really that legendary person. If he was really that person from the legends, then losing to this person would not be considered too shameful. At this moment, he missed dearly that black MXT that had self-destructed on that flagship. The Mulberry Sea in the middle of the night was like the sinister grasslands of the giant kingdom. Starlight cascaded down from the dome above, and those dense branches and leaves that swayed gently in the night wind were like the countless tentacles of a monster, ready to bind and devour the people who were trying to escape at any moment. Those dense rustling sounds were like demons eating with a smile on their faces, making people shudder in fear. The Peach Miasma Mecha, covered in metal boxes, was currently lying on its side in an empty space in the forest like a giant pile of metal trash. The temperature of the mecha had already dropped significantly, so in the cool night, it should be able to hide from the infrared scanning systems of the pursuers. Sulo leaned against a mulberry tree. The weeds beneath him were somewhat damp and cool, making his lungs feel uncomfortable. He used his hand to cover his mouth, stopping all the coughing, his face showing an unhealthy flush. The dog-eat-dog of the Empire had nothing to do with him. Those pursuers had heard the coughing and rushed over. Killing that Empire officer did not make him feel the slightest bit of guilt, but for the sake of his own safety, he still needed to be a little more careful. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the empty space beside the mecha more than 10 meters away. The night was dark, but his eyesight allowed him to see everything clearly. That Empire officer seemed to have tried to contact someone earlier, but had failed. The Empire officer's expression was rather heavy. After using a first aid kit to treat his wounds, he had been sitting silently under another tree, eyes closed, resting. From that somewhat shocking amount of HP, it was possible to determine that the opponent had suffered a very serious injury. However, Sulo did not have the urge to help the opponent. Even for the sake of his own safety, he was willing to let this powerful opponent be a little weaker. Moreover, this kind of freakish human resembling Mad Manly probably would not die so easily. In the darkness of the mulberry forest, the two of them did not speak, each thinking about their own concerns. Earlier in the dining hall, Sulo had been puzzled as to why this Empire officer had such a heavy expression. Now that he was more and more certain of the other's identity, he could more or less understand. Thus, the only question that truly troubled him was that gunshot at the beginning of today's assassination. Why would the ACW secretly developed by the Federation appear within the Empire's borders? Why would it appear in the hands of those assassins? Sulo pondered in silence for a long time. He could only think of one explanation, and that was that in these past few decades, the Federation had never stopped infiltrating the Empire, and might even be secretly collaborating with certain Empire factions. The night gradually deepened, the stars gradually shifted, and the temperature gradually dropped. Under one of the mulberry trees, Sulo narrowed his eyes and looked at the Empire officer under the other tree. Seeing that his breathing was gradually calmer and his shoulders naturally shrunk inward, he understood that under the condition of blood loss, this person should be feeling somewhat cold. Other than shivering clothes, humans also had a way to resist the cold. Although this kind of sleep was often fatal, it was always hard to resist the instinctive choice. The wind was still blowing the branches of the mulberry trees, rustling them in a monotonous manner that induced sleep. Sulo remained motionless. He silently looked in that direction, counting the other's breathing rate. Only after counting for nearly an hour did he lower his gaze and slowly take off his shoes. Immediately afterward, he took off his dusty and blood-stained silk jacket, gently wetting it in the small hole under the tree and tying it around his neck. Then, he silently stood up and carefully took a step back. His bare feet stepped on the soft, wet grass without making any sound. Not even the insects in the grass were startled. He took a second step and once again approached the mulberry forest behind him, forcibly suppressing his heartbeat and controlling his breathing. Then came the third step. As long as he entered the sea of darkness behind him, who could catch him? However, at this moment, a silent vibration suddenly came from his shoulders, causing his footsteps to freeze in place. Lowering his head to look, the bracelets tied to the two bloody holes above his shoulder blades weakly lit up 3 times. After a moment of silence, Sulu inwardly sighed and lightly shook his head. Under the mulberry tree 10-some meters away, Huai Chaoshi slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were abnormally bright as he looked at Sulu and said in a hoarse voice, "I always thought you to be a smart person. Now, it seems that you have made a few mistakes in your judgment." His voice was suppressed to an extremely low level. The night birds resting in the forest were still in their sweet dreams, undisturbed. However, he knew that Sulu should have been able to clearly hear his words. "The enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. Those people who want to kill me are probably also very willing to kill you." Huai Chaoshi said with an indifferent expression, "The Empire is covered in chip detection equipment. Do you really think you can escape?" Sulu was silent for a moment. Naturally, he would not explain his final card to his opponent. He walked back to his own mulberry tree and somewhat tiredly sat down as if he had done nothing. "In addition, this time, I don't know if I can survive." Huai Chaoshi looked at him and said, "But before I die, I will definitely kill you first, so you had best pray that I can survive." Chapter 595. What followed was silence. The forest was silent. Sulu and Huai Chaoshi were like two statues, sitting silently under their respective mulberry trees. Only when the willow trees began to turn white on the horizon did they suddenly open their eyes at the same time. It was not because they were startled awake by the light, but because they had smelled a dangerous scent coming from the mulberry forest at the same time. Sulu placed his palm on the ground and focused on feeling that faintly discernible vibration. Huai Chaoshi, on the other hand, came under the peach miasma mecha. Looking at the external sound wave monitoring equipment on the side of the mecha, she slowly frowned. "Let's go," Huai Chaoshi said briskly. Sulu did not hesitate. He got up and walked towards the mecha. Accompanied by the clear sound of electricity, the peach miasma mecha stood like a god, crossing the branches of the mulberry trees to face the rising sun. The two of them climbed up the mecha, coughing loudly as they climbed. The coughs were hoarse and dry, like dried mulberry leaves being torn apart by angry silkworms, but they also carried a sense of unbridled joy. The injured and tired duo had held back their coughs for an entire night. Now that they had confirmed that the enemy had caught up, they naturally did not need to hold back anymore. Of course, they would cough to their heart's content. The rebel army more than 10 kilometers away should have heavy armored vehicles or mecha. Otherwise, they would not have left such clear curves on the surveillance equipment. The peach miasma mecha's hatch closed, and its engine roared once more. The crystal ores that made Su Li's heart ache underwent primitive atomization, powering the heavy body of the mecha to become a giant bird in the morning. It swept up at an angle, cleverly bypassing the dense mulberry trees and advancing at high speed. 10 minutes later, a loud roar came from outside the mulberry forest that had regained its peace. The entire ground began to tremble. The forest birds that had just woken up and the insects in the grass fled in all directions in fear. Almost 20 black and green Imperial Night Wolf mechas surrounded them. Their heavy alloy bodies crushed the grass in the forest into a mess, sending mud and stone tumbling. After confirming that the target had once again left, this mecha troop did not blindly scatter in all directions. Instead, they stopped temporarily. The cockpit of one of the mecha opened up, and an Empire military officer with the rank of colonel walked out with a gloomy expression. He crouched down under a mulberry tree and carefully searched for any traces. The Imperial officer's fingertips gently slid across the tree trunk, touching a smear of blood that was about to solidify. His gloomy expression seemed to relax a little, but no one noticed that his fingertips were trembling violently. In front of his subordinates, this officer had to maintain absolute calmness and confidence, but in the depths of his heart, to carry out such a terrifying mission, to hunt down that important figure, his heart had long been endlessly terrified that in the next 10 days or so, in the sea of mulberry trees on planet Liban, 7 or 8 teams like this mecha troop appeared. These Imperial troops of unknown power silently and patiently pursued that mecha. No reinforcements came. The Peach Miasma mecha was alone in the sea of mulberry trees, dealing with these rebel troops. Even though the two people in the mecha's cockpit were the strongest mecha warriors in the universe, facing the pursuit of almost 200 mecha, they could not actively choose to fight head-on. Moreover, Su Li's internal strength was completely destroyed, and Hui Chaoshi was heavily injured. The situation was very critical. Fortunately, the mulberry trees on this planet were shockingly large, giving the Peach Miasma mecha enough space to escape. In the process of escaping, the Peach Miasma mecha braved the danger of being monitored by the enemy and finally succeeded in contacting a certain intelligence source. However, Hui Chaoshi still had no way of fully grasping the current situation on planet Liban. Right now, he could only try to find a safe escape route as quickly as possible. The Imperial mecha squad conducting this pursuit clearly knew who their target was. Even those soldiers who had not dared to believe their ears at first were able to confirm this fact after more than 10 mecha had fallen tragically at the hands of the Peach Miasma mecha. All of the Imperial soldiers were incomparably fearful of that Peach Miasma mecha, or more accurately, the person inside the Peach Miasma mecha. However, since they had chosen this path of rebellion from the very beginning, there was no turning back. Instead, because of the trembling fear in the depths of their hearts, they became even crazier. In the last few mecha encounters in the Mulberry Forest Sea, the rebel army's mecha had become crazier each time, more reckless than the last. They knew that defeat was certain, but they continued to surround the Peach Miasma mecha like moths to a flame, attacking the Peach Miasma mecha at all costs. It was as if even if they had to pay the price of destroying their mecha and losing their lives in exchange for the malfunction of one of the Peach Miasma mecha's most important sensors, they felt that it was worth it. Watching silently from the sidelines, Su Li gradually understood the intentions of those rebel mecha. His face grew paler and paler, but he continued to operate the Peach Miasma mecha like an emperor. The undefeatable Hui Chaoshi also understood the rebel army's intentions, but he had no way of changing the situation. The Peach Miasma mecha moved as fast as lightning, unparalleled in its evasion and retreat. Its close combat spear was swift and fierce, not a single rebel mecha could last more than 10 seconds against it. On a normal battlefield, this mecha battle would have undoubtedly ended with the Peach Miasma mecha's victory. This was because it could move around like a shark, cruelly searching for opportunities to attack shoals of fish, and then retreating again. If this simple cycle continued, the rebel army's mecha horde would eventually be wiped out. However, in this mulberry forest, the Peach Miasma mecha could not do this. This was because there was no supply base here, and there were no components and materials needed to repair the mecha. The rebel army's mecha horde chased relentlessly, all because they wanted to force the person they respected the most to never have time to rest. Their injuries and exhaustion would continuously eat away at that person's strength. At the same time, they also wanted to continuously wear down the peach miasma mecha's body. In this primitive agricultural area, if the mecha could not be repaired, then it could only be nibbled to death by shoals of fish. During the process of their escape, Sulu had been diligently observing or studying the mecha controls of this empire elite. Even if tomorrow morning or the next moment, this innocent fish in the pond would be burned to death, he still devoted a great deal of energy to this task. This was because the other's level of mecha control was truly very high. From the perspective of someone at his level, he was able to experience much more, even gaining a certain sense of fierce beauty. What shocked him the most, or perhaps more accurately, terrified him, was that even though they had been on the run for more than 10 days and nights, this Empire officer beside him had actually been able to maintain a valiant combat prowess, as well as a vigorous desire for battle that he could not comprehend. Although this person's cheeks were becoming thinner and thinner, the light in those small eyes had never once dimmed. However, just as the several mecha units in pursuit had hoped, the heavily injured and bone-deep exhausted Huai Chaoshu held on valiantly. Meanwhile, the peach miasma mecha could not withstand the increasing wear and tear of its components and metal fatigue, finally collapsing at some quiet dusk. In the blood-red twilight, the heavy and massive peach miasma mecha crashed to the ground, kicking up a cloud of dirt and dust. Fortunately, the dense mulberry trees around it blocked the dust from reaching into the air. Not too far away was a row of simple and crude village houses. Judging from the row of hydraulic gears behind the houses, this should be a mechanical mill used to process mulberry trees. This row of mills was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, glowing faintly with a bright red light. The emergency hydraulic valves activated, and the peach miasma mecha's cockpit opened up a little. The new model mecha lying diagonally on the ground now looked like a patient gasping for air, waiting for death. Huai Chaoshu and Su Lo crawled out from the open cockpit. The two of them were covered in small wounds, looking rather haggard. However, from the silent expressions on their faces, not a trace of it could be seen. An hour ago, when Su Lo had been considering whether or not to remind this person that the mecha's components had already passed the critical threshold and that it could shut down at any moment, the central control computer of the peach miasma mecha had blared out a shrill alarm. Huai Chaoshu had silently operated the mecha to begin the fastest ambush they had made since their escape, all the way to this stretch of red mills. The rebel mecha should still be 20 kilometers away. Huai Chaoshu stood under the overturned mecha, narrowing his eyes slightly as he looked up at the setting sun on the horizon, silently calculating the time. Then, he coughed twice and led Su Lu towards the row of red mills. The two of them entered the red mill to get some water, but they found no trace of anyone. It seemed that the faction that had betrayed the imperial family had at least taken control of the Mulberry province. They had cleaned up this vast farming region of mulberry forests very thoroughly. After drinking, Huai Chaoshu walked to the west wall of the red mills and narrowed his eyes to look out. The Red Rose still had not been contacted. Right now, he only had sporadic feedback from the crows in the bureau. He had no idea how dangerous the current situation was, but there were more than 200 Imperial mecha chasing after him. It was easy to imagine that the situation on this planet was very bad. Would there really be a problem this time? Huai Chaoshu narrowed his eyes. He looked like an ordinary Imperial military officer, but in reality, he was definitely not ordinary. He had never doubted himself in his life, but he had never experienced something like this. As long as he was in the mecha, he was an undefeatable god. However, at this moment, the peach miasma mecha had become a pile of alloy garbage outside the mill. In the entire sea of mulberry trees, there was no way to find the parts needed to repair it. What was waiting for him? Being killed by his own subjects in his own planetary sector? A self-deprecating smile appeared on Huai Chaoshu's face. He suddenly felt that the red setting sun on the horizon was fake. Otherwise, why would his body feel so cold? Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the flowing water in the tunnel below the mill. After a long silence, he suddenly asked, "What do you think?" At this time, there were only 2 people in the red mills, so the person he was asking this question was very clear. Sulu frowned and looked over, looking at the pale face of the Imperial Royal in the twilight. He did not expect that this seemingly ordinary but actually extremely arrogant person would ask for his opinion. Chapter 596. No opinion, Sulu replied in a low voice. This is an internal matter for you Empire people, and I am a member of the Federation. If you are referring to the method of escape, I believe you have seen my file. My level of tactical deduction has never been high. These 2 people in the red mill were both extremely cold and ruthless. For different reasons, they were used to silence. However, for some reason, Sulu became more talkative in front of this person. For a second, he thought of his own childhood. Back then, he had lived with his parents and sister. He seemed to have a lot to say. Even when he was an orphan, he still spoke a lot. Perhaps it was because he later met a nagging uncle that he became less and less talkative. Actually, I think the key question now is whether or not your emperor will survive this assassination attempt. Sulu woke up from his momentary daze. He looked at him and said, "If he dies, even if you escape this planet, you won't be able to survive." Huai Chaoshi frowned. She did not expect this Federation member to see the most fatal part of the situation so quickly. Sulu paused for a moment. He looked at the Empire officer and continued, "Your Highness, those people even dared to assassinate you. Naturally, they will kill your father first." Hearing the words "Your Highness," Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes. A glint flashed through her eyes. After a moment of silence, she still did not give any response. Sulu looked into her eyes and said, "Rumor has it that you passed Mecha level 6 at the age of 12. I have a proud friend who has you as his goal. After these days of escape, I can confirm that you are indeed the most talented and powerful pilot in the universe. So, I don't understand why you didn't choose to break out of the encirclement at the beginning of the attack. Instead, you chose to enter this mulberry sea." The proud friend he was referring to was Tai Yuan. This Federation's Shadow Prince had once said that there were only 5 people in the entire universe who were his goal. I don't know the situation outside. Mulberry Sea is suitable for guerrilla warfare and escape. Huai Chaoshi replied expressionlessly, "I didn't expect that so many Imperial soldiers would dare to betray the Imperial family. First, they would use the ACW, which no one in the Empire knew about, to launch a long-range attack. Then, they would use a missile attack. Finally, they would use a mole. Finally, they would tear off the disguise and directly use the heavy armored forces to launch a frontal attack." Sulu knew the power struggle within the Empire, but in his opinion, this assassination plan was very reasonable. If he was not so familiar with the activation curve of the ACW, perhaps the pride of the Empire in front of him, the powerful princess, would have died under that terrible big gun. However, this kind of assassination arrangement also revealed some kind of information. The force that dared to betray the royal family obviously only wanted to solve the problem in the simplest and fastest way in the beginning. They didn't want to make too much of a commotion. It was only later that they were forced by the situation that the whole incident gradually escalated. From this, it seemed that the force that betrayed the royal family didn't completely control the situation on this planet. "You should contact a reliable subordinate on this planet," Sulu suggested. "I can't contact Red Rose. There are too few sources of information. I can't judge who is trustworthy." Huai Chaoshi glanced at the watch on her wrist and said, "The traders will need at most 3 hours to see through my last disguise and find this red mill. I hope you can provide some meaningful suggestions." Sulu lowered his head and coughed twice in pain. He squinted at the princess and couldn't help but shake his head. Why did the princess ask for help from him, a member of the Federation, and make it sound so natural? I think the Empire's satellites should also have a micro-positioning system. He looked up at the blood-red sky outside the window and said, the fact that the traitors haven't been able to surround you means that they can't use the satellite positioning system. So it's very simple. Whoever has the authority of the satellite positioning system is your people. Huai Chaoshi said, the authority of the satellite positioning system is in the hands of Governor Kubowning. After a pause, she continued coldly, even if you can contact this person, you can't escape without a mecha right now. Seeing this person's attitude, Su-Luk felt a little strange. The traitors wanted to kill him, but why was this princess so cold and calm as if it had nothing to do with her? I don't think it's impossible to escape without a mecha. You are one of the most powerful people I've ever seen. Su-Luk looked at her pale cheeks and suddenly said, of course, if you think I'm a burden, you can let me go. After all, I can't escape the Empire. I can only stay in this sea of mulberry trees. Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes. She was about to ask who this person was, but when she heard the last sentence, she almost laughed coldly. She said, don't try to leave my side. Then maybe you can put that Jinchi in my body. Take it back. You should be able to judge that having a fighting force like me will be very helpful for your escape. 1. That's impossible. Huai Chaoshi looked at him coldly. 2. Your tactical deduction skills are really bad. In this kind of flat, non-man-made forest, facing more than 20 military-use mecha, no one can rely on their own physical strength to escape the encirclement. Just now, when you were staring blankly at the sunset, I checked this mechanical mill. After a moment of silence, Su-Luk suddenly said, I found a lot of mechanical farming tools below. This should be the farm owner's warehouse. Farm owner, Huai Chaoshi corrected him expressionlessly. She frowned and asked coldly, and? I can fix the peach miasma for you, Su-Luk said, staring into her eyes. Huai Chaoshi looked back at him silently, as if she was looking at an idiot. I'm the designer of the MX mecha. I'm the Federation's most talented mechanic. No matter how good a mechanic is, it's impossible to use a bunch of farming tools to fix an intricate military-use mecha, replied Huai Chaoshi coldly, clearly not believing him. When the war god traveled thousands of miles to assassinate your grandfather, he had been using parts from your empire's mecha to repair himself. As far as I know, that M37 mecha also used a lot of civilian machine parts in the end. Su-Luk looked at her and said, I may not be as good as you in terms of mecha combat. Of course, I'm definitely not as good as Lord War God, but when it comes to mecha repair skills, the two of you combined won't be as good as me. Of course, with just these farming tools, it's impossible for your peach miasma to become invincible again, but it can at least make it output 30% of its original power and run again. Hearing the two words War God, Huai Chaoshi's gaze suddenly sharpened, but she was somewhat convinced by Su-Li's words. However, she believed that this Federation member must have some ulterior motive for voluntarily displaying his strength at this time. What do you want? She asked directly. I want freedom, replied Su-Luk. Impossible. Huai Chaoshi's answer was extremely concise and powerful, like a long spear coldly cutting through a piece of metal, so firm that it made one's heart palpitate. Inside the red mill, it was silent. The two of them both knew that their pursuers were getting closer and closer, that the footsteps of death were getting clearer and clearer, but neither was willing to be the first to back down. They only stared calmly into each other's eyes, engaging in a battle of mental wills. It was like two battleships flying at high speed in a narrow waterway, seeing that the explosion of death was about to arrive, but each gripped the rudder firmly, unwilling to back down. The water below the red mill flowed silently and quietly. Suddenly, a leaf clamped between a mechanical gear fell down, lightly hitting the water with a soft thud, breaking the silence. You give me the mecha, and I'll give you a dignified death, said Huai Chaoshu expressionlessly. Su Li's eyes narrowed. He knew that this was the princess' bottom line. If the other party was willing to keep her promise, then at the very least, he wouldn't have to worry that the Empire would use this method of humiliating him to strike a blow to the morale of the Federation's citizens, causing those friends he cared for and loved to grieve once more. He blinked lightly and said in a monotonous voice, I want the authority of the Peach Miasma. I want to see the internal blueprints. I want you to open them all to me. Repairing the mecha doesn't require full authority, said Huai Chaoshu coldly. I insist, said Su Lu. Huai Chaoshu's eyes narrowed, her voice somewhat strange. You want to obtain the blueprints of the Peach Miasma so that you can escape back to the Federation in the future. You're very confident, even a little arrogant. As long as you have that doglet-like chip behind your neck, you won't be able to escape. Su Lu looked into her eyes and said, whether or not I can escape is my business. I'll keep my eyes open and see just how you'll escape. Huai Chaoshu expressionlessly gave him the secret key to the highest authority of the Peach Miasma mecha. 3 hours later, 60 to 70 Imperial Moon Wolf mechas crushed the surrounding mulberry trees, crushed the tranquility, and crushed the shadow cast by the red mill on the water. With a roar, they charged in from 3 directions, tightly surrounding this row of houses. Unlike the crazy pursuit of the past dozen days and nights, today, these Imperial rebel mechas finally surrounded their revered highness. However, they did not immediately launch an attack. Instead, they silently guarded the perimeter. The dirt on the metal belts gave off the smell of rotting leaves under the starlight. This assassination operation had been going on for so many days. The rebel mecha squad had already confirmed that their highness terrifying Peach Miasma mecha's weapon system had been completely destroyed under their continuous and frenzied attacks. Moreover, in this vast Mulberry Sea agricultural area, there was no way to repair it. Colonel Na Song of the Imperial Military Special Mecha Brigade walked down from his mecha with a complicated expression. He looked at the red mill not far away and hesitated to give the order to attack. After a long internal struggle, he walked alone toward the row of red mill houses. With a thud, he knelt on one knee and said in a trembling voice, Your Highness, you are the pride of the Empire. We don't want to hurt you. As long as you are willing to leave with us, I will guarantee your safety on the honor of the military and the family. Chapter 597. In one of the most heavily guarded manors on the Liban star. The light from the broken lamps, which imitated the starlight of the night sky, refracted and fluctuated inside the spacious building like flowing water, making the exquisite jade carving on the black sandalwood table seem as if it was about to come alive. The jade carving was of a spring silkworm. Below the white curve was a thin piece of jade that resembled a mulberry leaf. In contrast, the jade silkworm's body was round and cute, completely without the disgusting feeling that ordinary insects gave people. The mulberry tree and silkworm had an important symbolic meaning to this planet, so when this manor was being renovated, the most famous sculptor of the empire chose it as the object to carve, which won the appreciation of the manor owner and all the nobles. A young noble wearing a black silk coat gently stroked Jade Silkworm's body. His slightly gloomy face suddenly twitched as he coldly said, His Majesty is already old and muddle-headed, but the Empire and the royal family have no reason to pay the price for his old and muddle-headed behavior. For decades, in the Zwitian Star region, no one dared to criticize the high and mighty emperor like this. Those poor rebels on the remote planets may have angrily preached similar words in front of the fire, but their stinking heads had been piled on the ancient city wall, and their corpses were burned to ashes and thrown into the stinking puddles. After the young noble said this, he still appeared very calm. Looking at the night sky outside the manor, he raised his arm and said with a cold smile, Look at this planet. The emperor actually allowed those lowly people to eat together with us in the same school. What is he trying to do? Did he forget the noble bloodline of the royal family, forget the oath of the nobles? And this time's hunting plan? A cold smile appeared on his face. The 3 technological breakthroughs of the Empire that are most likely to change the situation of the universe were actually used by him to kill a commander of the Federation. Think about the Westwoods Expeditionary Force 2 years ago that was destroyed because of his reckless orders. What kind of crazy emperor would do such a crazy thing? The luxuriously dressed middle-aged man behind Jade's silkworm had been silent and did not answer these treasonous accusations. It was not until now that he raised his head and said with a frown, the time-travel hunting plan was drawn up by the military ministry. As for the destruction of the Westwoods Expeditionary Force, I don't know what His Majesty thinks. The middle-aged man was Kobowning, an important minister of the Empire's famous liberal faction. He was also the governor of Liban Star. Because of his ability and charming demeanor, this person had a very good reputation in the aristocratic circle. Moreover, he also had a strong appeal among the commoners of Liban Star. However, in these dozen or so days and nights, Governor Kobowning had already found it difficult to maintain his composure. With a heavy expression, he stared at the young noble in front of him and said, "Speaking of madness, His Majesty ignored the staunch opposition of the Council of Elders and your father and made you a duke at such a young age. Is this not madness?" But the young duke was actually covered in explosives and trapped me in the governor's mansion. Isn't that crazy? If you were really so loyal to His Majesty, when I expressed my intentions, you should have chosen to summon the troops to kill me, even if it meant dying together with me. A trace of mockery appeared on the young duke's face. But you hesitated. For His Majesty and that powerful prince, hesitation means betrayal. If His Highness was allowed to live, do you think you would still be able to survive? Governor Kobowning's expression became even darker. After a moment of silence, he said, "I really can't believe this was your father's intention. How could His Highness betray His Majesty because of these things?" No, father's vigilance didn't last long. If it wasn't for the tragic death of County King Carlton, how could he have the courage to fight his brother? The young noble lowered his eyes slightly and said slowly, "I don't understand what you mean," Governor Kobowning said in a low voice. "How much did Uncle Carlton do for the Empire, for His Majesty?" The young noble said with a trace of emotion. Back then, the entire Empire's West Star Line was dyed red by his troops. For the stability of the Empire, he killed countless lowly people, but he only received the title of Butcher. Those people who hated him to the core, who would have thought that he was actually just a knife, but the knife has always been in His Majesty's hands. He turned around, stared into Governor Kobowning's eyes, and said coldly, "Right now, the most brutal and persistent untouchables in the Empire have all been killed by this blade. Our Emperor is carrying out interracial education on this planet and the Great Class Harmony movement. He wants to play the role of a benevolent and fair king in front of billions of untouchables. How can he allow this blade to continue appearing in front of people and remind those untouchables how many of their family members the royal family has killed? What are you talking about?" Governor Kobowning stared at the young noble and said loudly, "County King Carlton sacrificed himself on the battlefield for the Empire." "What does this have to do with His Majesty?" "Died on the battlefield." The young noble's pupils slightly dilated, with a trace of crazy mockery. "With your intelligence, do you think you'll believe this? Or does His Majesty think that the intelligence of all nobles has dropped to this level?" A spaceship of the Federation, a member of the Federation, forced his way through the space channel, and then, in the Empire's star region, faced with a powerful ghost fleet, he easily killed the commander of the fleet and blew up the flagship. Is this possible? Is that member of the Federation Lipifu? The young noble widened his eyes and said coldly, "The most chilling thing is, Our Invincible Highness was on the flagship at that time. Who could kill Uncle Carlton in front of him?" Governor Kobowning was silent for a long time, and then said with a pale face, You think this is all a scheme? Of course. The young noble's voice gradually calmed as he said coldly, "No one knows when the butcher's knife in His Majesty's hand will be swung again in order to please those lowly commoners and to create his image as a benevolent ruler. Who will die under his butcher's knife next?" Father, me, and many people in Tianjing understood everything. We didn't want to sit and wait for death, so we had to stand up and face the battle. Although the flagship exploded in the end and there weren't many videos left, there were many witnesses. The military also investigated and confirmed that there was no problem with County King Carlton's death, Governor Cobounning said with a frown. With His Majesty's power, I'd believe it even if there were 4 million witnesses. As for Father's investigation, Her Highness controls the Intelligence Bureau, so she wouldn't let the military find anything. You think Her Highness killed County King Carlton? Yes. Watch your words. Your speculation is baseless, Governor Cobounning said sternly. I won't allow you to insult Her Highness' character like this. Burning like the sun, warming the entire empire, was Her Highness when she was young. She rarely appeared in front of people these years. Who knows what she's become? For a future empress, what kind of cruelty and viciousness wouldn't she do? The young noble said coldly. Governor Cobounning took a few deep breaths to suppress the anger in his heart. He stared at the other and said, "What did you do to His Majesty?" The young noble didn't answer him. He stroked the smooth jade silkworm and stayed silent for a long time until a dark shadow appeared between his brows. He then raised his head proudly and said to himself, "Even if we can't do anything, as long as we kill the heir he appointed, I believe that the empire can go back to the right path in the future." At this moment, the watch on his wrist vibrated slightly. He lowered his head to look, and a strange smile appeared on his lips. He said calmly, "Governor, let me tell you a piece of good news. You don't have to worry about me torturing you to get the satellite authority anymore, because Our Highness has been surrounded." The Red Mill was not dark in the night. Instead, it was eye-catching. When White Sausher's expressionless face appeared at the window of the Red Mill, it was even more eye-catching. It attracted a slight noise from the surrounding mechas. At this time, there were dozens of Imperial Moon Wolf mechas surrounding the Red Mill. These mechas only needed a simple sweep of their cannons to turn this row of crude mills and her into red powder. No matter how powerful she was, she could only welcome death. However, these Imperial soldiers who dared to betray His Majesty maintained a temporary silence. Through the screens in their mechas, they looked in that direction with complicated emotions. Because the person who appeared at the window of the Red Mill was the idol of all the Imperial soldiers. When she was still a young girl, she had already received the adoration and love of countless subjects. Because she was Her Highness. Na Song, who sent you? The military or your family? Your sickly father, does he know that you participated in this treason? White Chowsher looked at the Imperial officer kneeling on one knee in front of the room and asked calmly. Although she had not recovered from her injuries, if she wanted to, she could still kill this person or take him hostage at any time before the rebel mechas attacked. However, this was meaningless. These rebel mechas dared to take the risk of having their entire family executed to participate in this assassination. Naturally, they had already placed life and death outside of their scope of consideration. A calm conversation, maintaining the demeanor of a royal highness, could temporarily alleviate the tense situation. However, she knew that as the noble officer in front of her said, if she did not surrender, the military mechas in front of the Red Mill would move. White Sausher's ears trembled slightly. She listened to the faint noise behind her that was covered by the sound of flowing water. She silently calculated the time, not knowing if she could delay until the Federation person completed his mission. Your Highness, Father did not know. Please forgive our actions because we only want the Empire to return to the right path. The Imperial noble officer named Na Song knelt on one knee and said loudly, the Federation is already preparing to attack. We need a stronger leader. If your Highness is willing to accept what has happened and forgive the nobles who were forced to participate in this matter, I am willing to be your personal soldier and accompany you to win this war. After saying this, Na Song felt much more relaxed. He took a deep breath. Just as he was about to continue persuading, his pupils suddenly shrank and he became nervous. The ground under his knees suddenly trembled slightly. Chapter 598. Truth. What truth? White Xiaoshi's eyes suddenly narrowed. Soon after, she said lightly, there is no truth. The nobles only know how to show greedy eyes in the dark night. How can they hurt His Majesty the Emperor? Na Song didn't hear Her Highness answer clearly. His rapidly narrowing pupils had been tightly grasped by the scene in front of him. In the beginning, he didn't know where the nervousness in his heart came from. It wasn't until the ground under his knees suddenly began to tremble slightly and a faint buzzing sound came from the red mill shrouded in darkness that he finally understood what was happening at this moment. Impossible. After more than 10 days of crazy and reckless mecha pursuit, Her Highness Peach Miasma Mecha couldn't possibly hold on. There were no military bases in this vast mulberry sea, no factories, and not even an automated assembly line. Before they surrounded the Red Mill, his mecha unit had carefully monitored for a period of time and confirmed that Her Highness Mecha had lost all mobility. In fact, Her Highness' new mecha, which left a deep impression with countless metal boxes hanging from its joints, looked like a pile of metal trash. It had been lying quietly and helplessly on its side by the stream behind the Red Mill just now. It was like a pile of metal trash. Why did this pile of metal trash suddenly move? He was stunned in place, still in a kneeling position. He raised his head to look at the tall shadow in front of him. This shadow was as heavy as millions of tons of steel. His body suddenly stiffened. This was the last question the Imperial officer Na Song asked before his life ended. In the middle of the night, in the Red Mill by the stream, the rebel army's mecha stared in shock at the terrifying mecha that looked like a demon. It woke up from its deathly stillness and returned from hell. It stood up at high speed with a loud roar and smashed through the shabby houses, causing dust and debris to fill the air. At this critical moment when the situation suddenly changed, there was a moment when time stopped. In this short period of time, in the dim cockpit of the Peach Miasma Mecha filled with the smell of inferior engine oil, Su Li's eyes were abnormally bright. His gaze pierced through the light screen in front of him and stared at the back of the figure in front of the crumbling Red Mill. That person's back was a little thin. She, who usually gave people a feeling of invincibility, appeared so small and weak under the heavy metal mecha's feet. As long as he gave the command, the Peach Miasma Mecha would raise its gigantic mechanical legs and stomp the opponent into meat paste. The Federation's most powerful and dangerous enemy had suddenly become an ant that could be easily stepped on because of such an opportunity that was hard to replicate. This kind of temptation was hard to resist. The Peach Miasma Mecha had been repaired, and its power output was now at 37%. If he could kill this person in front of him in one blow, Sulu had a 60% chance of avoiding the encirclement of these traitors and driving the Peach Miasma into the dark night. However, the person he wanted to kill the most had his back facing the Peach Miasma Mecha, but his hands were behind his back the entire time. A remote control device was emitting a faint light between the pair of hands that didn't seem to be strong but rather delicate. With just a glance, Sulu suddenly felt the 2 bloody holes above his shoulder blades begin to hurt. It was as if his blood and bones would explode in the next moment, turning him into a miserable corpse. The other party hadn't pressed the remote control, but just the thought of it made him feel cold. Even though they were surrounded by danger, Sulu in the cockpit and White Xiaoshi in the shadows of the mecha still managed to make a bet in such a short amount of time. They were betting on who was faster, and the chips were each other's lives. Su Li's bright eyes abruptly dimmed. Expressionlessly, he suppressed that impulse. His right hand quickly entered the mimicry command and opened the hatch of the Peach Miasma mecha. The Federation's mecha horde had reacted quickly enough. By the time they noticed the abnormality, the Moon Wolf mecha, which had been in a state of alert all this time, began to howl and pounce forward. At the same time, the long-range weapons on its mechanical arms were ready to fire. However, they were still faster than that mecha and that person. The Peach Miasma mecha burst out of the red mill, abruptly becoming a shadow. Huai Chaoshi stood expressionlessly in front of the window. The window frame gradually shattered, the walls crumbling. The scene around her seemed to accelerate in time and then rapidly crumble. She coldly looked at Na Song, who still hadn't managed to retract his stunned expression. Her feet pushed off the ground, and in a dense gust of air, her body quickly flew backwards. After more than 10 days and nights of pursuit, the large patches of blood-stained silk clothing were severely damaged. As she flew backwards, it scattered in all directions, like the ancient robes of a god fluttering in the starlight. The hatch of the Peach Miasma mecha behind her had already opened. She was like a monarch returning to the throne that represented power. Returning to her seat, the howling and sharp sounds of gunfire rang out. The mulberry trees in 3 directions in front of the red mill were viciously cut down by the sharp shrapnel. The white stubble jutted out sharply, splinters flying in all directions. Suddenly, the rebel mecha horde were attacked, and the muffled sound of gunfire was deafening. It was only then that the rebel soldiers in the mecha realized that although they had done a lot of preparation work, they still had no way of getting access to the data of the ammunition ratio of His Highness's mecha. It was even possible that the data of the ammunition they had was fake data deliberately sent out by His Highness's intelligence department. Because of this fatal error in intelligence, the rebel mecha horde had never imagined that Her Highness Peach Miasma mecha would have such a shocking amount of ammunition. Instantly, a small opening appeared in the encirclement. Of course, the most fatal reason for this situation still puzzled them. This had nothing to do with intelligence. This Peach Miasma mecha had clearly been severely damaged and could not be activated. Why did it have to be activated again at the most critical moment? Amidst the flying shrapnel, there was the ear-piercing sound of the heavy mecha stomping through the ground at high speed. After the Peach Miasma mecha's sudden display of power, the rebel mecha, and even Su Lo, who was in the Peach Miasma cockpit, all thought that Huai Chaoshi would choose to retreat quickly after this wave of fierce attacks. She would leap over the small stream behind the mill and throw herself into the darkness that could hide everything. Thus, the 10 mecha flanking the rebel mecha horde rushed towards the small stream. They knew of Her Highness' near-invincible mecha battle strength and the terrifying mobility of the Peach Miasma mecha. If they didn't advance in advance, there was no way they could stop the other. However, contrary to everyone's expectations, Huai Chaoshi, who had quickly taken over control of the Peach Miasma mecha, valiantly chose an even more direct path. When the 2 flanking rebel mecha advanced towards the small stream at high speed, the Peach Miasma mecha charged straight ahead. The red mill collapsed to the ground. The walls were reduced to dust under the concentrated attack of bullets. Under the starlight, the dust on the walls actually looked a little like the miasma formed by the dew on pink peach blossoms. The Peach Miasma mecha whistled through the red miasma. The alloy body of the Peach Miasma mecha was wrapped in wisps of dust. With a speed that the naked eye could not see clearly, it coldly attacked the rebel mecha horde in front of it. With a hiss, a 5-meter-long multi-layered forged alloy gun was pulled out of its case. It spun at high speed in the mechanical arms, dancing with the starlight and red dust. It was like a giant and terrifying peach blossom. The Peach Miasma was poisonous. The peach blossom petals could not be blocked. Upon contact, one would die. The rebel mechs that were blocking the path of the Peach Miasma mech all fell to the ground in a flash of red, their mechs exploding. In the mulberry forest filled with the smell of burnt flesh, 6 Empire Moon Wolf mecha lay wretchedly on the ground. Their outer armor was damaged and curled up. Sparks flew in all directions. There were 2 mecha that had been knocked down that did not completely lose power. Their metal joints crackled, causing the mechanical arms to contract futilely and even sorrowfully like patients on their deathbed. The night wind blew past. The red mill had already been reduced to ruins. The dust gradually settled. The Empire officer named Nason had been crushed to death by the falling wall. His eyes were wide open and unwilling to close. The Peach Miasma mecha had long disappeared without a trace. The cockpit of the Peach Miasma mecha was silent. The lights were dim and only the rising and falling of the mecha indicated that it was running at high speed. After breaking through the encirclement of the mecha swarm, Wai Chaoshi did not take revenge on Su Lo for the trace of killing intent that had leaked out from the Peach Miasma mecha behind her. After a long period of silence, she suddenly said, "If you can repair the Peach Miasma mecha for me like you did today, even if it can only maintain 30% of its power output, I can still clear out all the rebel mecha in this sea of mulberry trees." Humans were the #1 machines. Hearing Huai Caoshi's calm and confident judgment, Su Lu suddenly remembered what the uncle had once said. This princess seemed to never feel tired. The strength in her body was inexhaustible. Her mind could always maintain a high level of concentration. She was like a cold machine. But she was still human. There is no such possibility. After coughing twice, he replied hoarsely, "You have to admit, your luck this time was too good. There just so happened to be enough parts in that storeroom, and the core components of the Peach Miasma mecha were not damaged. The miniature repair arm is also still functional. But even if you can find enough parts in this agricultural area, this kind of repair cannot be continued indefinitely. Using agricultural machinery to replace precision military mecha, even if it can be activated, as long as the mecha's engine is running, the severe wear and tear between the components will continue, and it will only worsen until the structure explodes." The cockpit once again fell silent. As a mecha combat genius, although Huai Chaoshi was far inferior to Su Lo in the field of mecha repair, she must have done some research. She knew that Su Li's judgment was correct. This person's repair skills were indeed shocking, but in the end, it could only be a temporary replacement and support for a period of time. After a long period of silence, she spoke again and asked coldly, "A few hours ago in the Red Mill, you once told me how Li Pifu assassinated my grandfather." Su Li's eyes narrowed. Looking at the side of her face, he said, "Back then, the war god traveled thousands of miles, hiding along the way, attacking the Empire's lone mecha. Then, he used these broken mecha parts to replace and repair them. Can this method still be used now?" Huai Chaoshi asked. "They are all Empire mecha. It should be easier to use," Su Lo replied with a smile. "Then let's do it this way," Huai Chaoshi said. "I will be responsible for hunting down those traitors' mecha. You will be responsible for repairing them." Chapter 599. A cold, powerful, and greedy specter of a mecha was floating in the sea of mulberry trees. In order to encircle and annihilate the specter, the rebel army, which had already arrived outside the Liban planet's atmosphere, had sent a large number of mechas and heavy armored troops into the Sea of Green. While the Governor-General, who controlled the most powerful military on the planet's surface, had been forced to remain silent, the rebel army could sweep through the entire planet. However, in front of the Spectre mecha, in the sea of mulberry trees where day and night alternated, the mechas and heavy armored troops suddenly felt like they had changed from being hunters to being hunted. They were confused and panicked until their hearts were shaken and they were secretly trembling in fear. Between dawn and dusk, the cold rainy night, and the scorching sun at noon, the mechas and heavy armored troops of the rebel army seemed to be under attack all the time. The mulberry leaves swayed in the wind, dispersing the shadows. A few cunning rabbits fled in panic among the weeds. The mechas that were carrying out reconnaissance missions or were alone were instantly destroyed by the Spectre mecha. Then, they were miserably torn apart into wreckage. It looked like their internal organs had been devoured by primitive barbarians who believed in demons. The main army of the rebel army had approached the Spectre mecha many times, but the Spectre mecha had used some unknown method to silently disappear from its original spot, leaving behind only the monotonous sea of mulberry trees, which was so dull that it made one's eyes go numb. It made a rustling sound, as if it was mocking the futility of these people. More and more mechas of the rebel army were destroyed in the encirclement. Not a single mecha could escape or even withstand the sneak attack of the Spectre mecha for a few seconds. Once they encountered the Spectre mecha, they would die. This shadow, which was like a curse, shrouded the entire encirclement army. When they thought about the identity and legend of the person in the cockpit of the Spectre mecha, the rebels could not help but feel extremely tense. The mecha was called Peach Miasma, but its body was painted with the black hibiscus flower that represented the imperial family of the empire. It moved like a specter through the dense, green mulberry forest. Most of the metal boxes hanging from the joints had been destroyed, and 70% of the original alloy armor had been destroyed. Instead, it had been replaced with armor that had been picked up from somewhere. There were still clear traces of the use of high-temperature cutting guns and welding guns on the armor plates. The outer armor, which looked like beggar's clothes, was sprayed with oil sputtering lines. Together with the damage marks left behind by the fierce battle, it looked like a painting of the Galaxy sect, which was famous for its ugliness and fury. The Peach Miasma mecha, which had never contributed anything in terms of aesthetics, now looked more like a walking pile of metal garbage than ever before. The internal components of the mecha had already been repaired countless times. Who knew how many parts had been swapped out? Those temporary replacement parts were helplessly wearing themselves down, letting out a sad, low grinding sound. The two slender mechanical legs, nearly 3 meters tall, were unable to ensure an absolutely precise dynamic balance because they had collected the spherical joints of two different mecha. Every time it moved forward at high speed, the Peach Miasma mecha would always tilt its body, like a walking pile of metal trash. Suddenly, it looked a little like a poor crippled metal patient. To make this mech that looked like it would fall apart at any moment move, to the point where it was close to going on strike countless times, only to once again let out a low rumble, and even to the point where it could continue to fight for many days and nights in a row. To be able to do all this was naturally thanks to the mechanic jointly cultivated by the Federal Nutshell Company and Uncle Feng Yu. The joys and sorrows of humans were not the same. The joys and sorrows of the people of the Federation and the people of the Empire were diametrically opposite. Fortunately, both sides had absolutely similar thinking patterns and the same baffling units of measurement and design concepts. Even the operation of the simple maintenance arm seemed to be the same. Even with Weizsäuscher's translation, Sulu could not fully understand the technical parameters on the Imperial mecha's components. However, when his hands touched the cold handle of the maintenance arm and pressed the switch, he very quickly began to familiarize himself with all the machinery, or rather, everything related to metal. And he fixed it. He even used the limited components to modify a rebel army electronic mecha station that the Peach Miasma mecha had destroyed. Although he did not succeed in infiltrating the rebel army's command system, he greatly improved the Peach Miasma mecha's electronic shielding ability. In the instant he completed the modification, Sulu thought of that truly amazing electronics expert he had met. Thinking of Gu Shifeng's 10 plump fingers, he silently assessed that among the ranks of normal combat forces, the Empire's electronics technology level was far inferior to the Federation's. The rebel army encirclement and suppression forces in the Mulberry Trees Sea were shocked and even terrified by the fact that the Peach Miasma mecha was like a specter, as if it would never have any mechanical problems. No matter how many intense mecha battles it experienced, the next time it appeared, it would still be in perfect condition. Although this Spectre mecha seemed to be becoming more and more tattered, the combat strength it displayed did not decrease in the slightest. The rebel army could not understand how the other had done this. Even though the staff officers had deduced some things from the pieces of the Moon Wolf mecha, they still found it hard to believe that there was someone in this universe who could complete this kind of repair work that required expensive and heavy equipment in this absolutely agricultural region. Moreover, the other party had completely used the parts of the Moon Wolf mecha to repair it. The rebel army officers gradually developed a misconception that the highness they were currently encircling was not fighting alone. In this vast sea of mulberry trees, there seemed to be a large logistics base operating continuously, providing an unending stream of powerful support for the Highness's Spectre mecha. However, this sea of mulberry trees had already been swept clean by the rebel army. Where could there possibly be a large logistics base? Why Chaoshi had not made any comments regarding the level of mecha repair Su Lu had displayed these past few days. That ordinary face of hers did not even reveal a trace of emotion, but deep down, she was already deeply shaken. She knew that this Federation man beside her was an extremely powerful soldier, even qualified to engage in a fair mecha battle with her. However, she did not care about any of this. Her valiant strength and self-confidence were enough to support her contempt for Su Lu. However, seeing how the Peach Miasma mecha had actually managed to hold out for so many days under this seemingly ordinary pair of hands, she could not help but feel admiration. Amidst the admiration was a strong sense of wariness. Amidst the wariness was confusion, the same confusion as those rebel army officers. The Federation's mecha research was not that far ahead of the Empire's. The level of the industry determined the level of operation. Huai Chaoshi could not understand how this person had managed to develop such inconceivable mecha repair skills. Could it be that this kind of thing also required talent? Chapter 601. While Huai Chaoshi was secretly shocked by Su Li's mechanical skills, Su Li's heart was also filled with endless admiration and even fear for her. He had never seen such a person in his life. Other than focusing on mechanical repair work, Su Lu had always maintained a normal rest, because his weak body was constantly on the alert. However, Huai Chaoshi, who was in charge of operating the Peach Miasma mecha, not only had to escape the pursuit of the rebel forces, she also had to constantly launch sneak attacks on the enemy's mecha. She had no time to rest at all. During the many days of tense escape, Su Lu had never seen this highness be able to maintain a high level of concentration, even if she closed her eyes once. There was not even a trace of fatigue to be seen. The rebel forces outside Li Ban Star's atmosphere, after taking control of the Red Rose, continuously released troops into the sea of mulberry trees. It was like an endless wave, constantly slapping against the black reef, each wave higher than the last, each wave stronger than the last. However, Huai Chaoshi, who did not have the slightest time to rest, controlled the Peach Miasma mecha to calmly and almost indifferently withstand all of these attacks. Humans are the first order of machines. Su Li's heart once again rang out with the uncle's words. The more time he spent with them, the more shocked he became. So there really was an existence like steel in this world. The tattered mecha moved at high speed through the dark forest. A young man and young woman in tattered clothes were silent in the dark cockpit. The roaring Peach Miasma broke through the heavy infantry barrier of the Aksyanma Hills. Under the torrential rain, the encirclement only left behind violent battle shadows. A certain Empire rebel army division that had urgently parachuted into the sea of mulberry trees was suddenly attacked by the Peach Miasma as soon as they arrived on the ground. The division commander died tragically in a decapitation plan, for the promise of dying with dignity, for the responsibility of the country, for some completely different reasons. Su Lu and Huai Chaoshi worked hand in hand, day after day. They continued to escape and counterattack. Tense repairs and fierce battles became their entire lives. The nobles who had betrayed the imperial family could not have imagined, nor could the madly searching for Her Highness the Princess in the Mulberry Sea. In truth, no one could have imagined that once the two most extraordinary individuals of the younger generation of the Federation and the Empire joined hands, they would erupt with such astonishing battle strength and accomplish an almost inconceivable goal that in the wee hours of the morning, the Peach Miasma Mecha, which had narrowly escaped the first aerial attack of the rebel army, welcomed a rare moment of temporary rest. The powerful Highness, like a demon, did not need to rest, but the soldiers of the rebel army could not endure this kind of intense battle. The morning light was dim, unable to spread across the entire land. The fog around the stream greatly reduced visibility. The tattered Peach Miasma Mech silently crouched on the rocky ground beside the stream. Sulu crouched beside the stream and splashed a handful of stream water on his stubbled face. The cold stream water flowed down his tangled dirty hair, spreading from his neck to his naked upper body. It made his body tremble, and he felt much more awake. He could not help but smile happily. Looking back, Wai Chaoshi was silently looking at the electronic manual in her hands, the pen between her fingers moving incessantly. She should be conducting some kind of communication. The silk coat she wore had long been torn to shreds, and she had changed into a mecha combat uniform. It had not been washed for many days, and the sour smell seemed to be coming from it from afar. Paired with that face full of dust, she did not look like a noble princess at all. Through hunting the rebel army's mecha, they knew some of the situation on Liban planet. Especially after Sulu successfully repaired the electronic mecha's equipment, Wai Chaoshi contacted even more of her loyal subordinates. She had a better understanding of the current situation and the inside story of this shocking assassination. The rebel fleet had already taken control of the outer space around Liban planet. Although they lacked long-range attacking battleships and were unable to control the situation on the entire planet, they had successfully cut off the connection between Tianjing and Liban planet. Now, no one knew what exactly had happened on Tianjing planet, or whether the emperor, who was in that vast and magnificent palace complex, was still doing well. This was the first rebellion led by the nobles in the empire's 100 years of history. Compared to the rebellion of the commoners and slaves, the nobles' rebel army had more resources and more powerful military force. The situation on Liban planet was dangerous and strange. A few great lords had already successively surrendered to the rebel army, but the numerous mechanized divisions under the control of the governor's office, the most powerful army on the planet, had maintained a strange silence, as if they did not know what was happening on the planet, nor did they see the fleets showing off their prowess outside the atmosphere. Through the information sent by the Intelligence Bureau's subordinates, along with Su Li's previous analysis, Wai Chaoshi guessed the reason for the current situation. The governor's office should have been controlled by the rebel army, but Governor Ko Bowning did not surrender. The rebel army was worried that killing him would trigger a counterattack from the governor's office, so they left him alive. Probably only an idiot like Louis would do such a stupid thing. He succeeded in ambushing the governor's office, but now he's stuck in the mud. Wai Chaoshi thought expressionlessly. Then her eyebrows slightly furrowed as she thought of the key information sent by her subordinates. It was from these few pieces of information that she found out something that she did not understand after she was ambushed. Even though the empire's reforms in the past few years had harmed the interests of some of the great nobles, under the powerful pressure of her father, these nobles still dared to launch a rebellion so hastily. They actually think that I killed Duke Carlton. Wai Chaoshi subconsciously looked at the stream. That man from the Federation was currently bathing in the stream with his upper body naked, revealing a mouthful of neat white teeth, smiling somewhat irritatingly. If he knew that he killed Duke Carlton and caused such a huge disturbance in the Empire, would he still be so carefree and happy? No, he would be happier. Wai Chaoshi thought unhappily with her eyebrows furrowed. Su Lu felt her gaze and scratched his head in confusion. He walked out of the stream, his bare feet stepping on the hard stones, and walked in front of her. He calmly stood in front of Huai Chaoshu, not in a hurry to grab clothes to cover his naked upper body, because after that luxurious silk coat was turned into silk, there was not a single piece of clothing on him, and he also did not have the habit of taking off clothes from the dead rebel soldiers to wear. The more important reason was that Su Luk found it very difficult to see this princess in front of him as the opposite sex, so there was nothing unnatural about it. There was once a joke. A man resentfully asked a strong woman, "Why are you so unlike a woman?" That woman coldly replied, "Because you are too unlike men." In front of a strong woman like Huai Chaoshu, most men would probably have a hard time finding a clear sense of gender. The question you asked last time, I can answer you now. Huai Chaoshu looked into his eyes and calmly said, "His Majesty is not dead." The information channels in the direction of Tianjing were sealed, the people on Liban Star had no idea what happened there, and she, who was in the sea of mulberry trees, had no information to confirm. However, it was precisely this suffocating silence that allowed her to confirm the emperor's safety. If the rebel army really succeeded in assassinating the ruler of Zhuotian Star region, how could it be so quiet? For you, this should be good news. After a slight pause, Su Lu said, "But it won't be of much help to our escape. I have to warn you again, this peach miasma mecha won't be able to last much longer. There is already a problem with the central wiring of the multi-engine storage room. I am a mechanic, not a magician. Once this type of core component is damaged, apart from replacing it, there is no other way. The problem is that we don't have any large-scale equipment that can be disassembled. Even if we do, in the entire sea of mulberry trees, there is no trace of any new Wolf Fang mecha." He spread out his hands, stared into her eyes, and asked seriously, "How many more days do we have to flee in this damned sea of mulberry trees before your people can come to our rescue?" Huai Chaoshu was silent for a long time. She didn't directly answer this question, only saying, "The longer, the better." Su Li's eyes narrowed, and he frowned. "You want to delay a little longer?" Huai Chaoshu smiled slightly. As long as the emperor wasn't dead, the rebel army wouldn't be able to completely control the situation. As long as the situation on Tianjing planet stabilized, the powerful royal fleet would be able to easily solve the problems on Liban planet like a knife cutting through paper. Huai Chaoshu had persevered in this treacherous sea of mulberry trees with extraordinary perseverance. Even though her subordinates had already prepared to help her escape 3 days ago, she still didn't leave. She was stalling for time. Only if she was alive and proved to the governor's office that she was still alive through battle would Governor Ko Bowning continue to persevere. "So that's how it is." Hearing Huai Chaoshu's calm explanation, Su Lu said, "If things really develop as you think, that Governor Ko Bowning will definitely be killed by the crazy and desperate nobles. I think that Governor Ko Bowning should have the self-awareness to sacrifice himself for the empire," Huai Chaoshu said coldly. Su Luk shook his head. He casually picked up a rock beside her and sat down. Using his hand to cover his mouth, he began to cough silently and painfully again. The desperate battle in the sea of mulberry trees came to an abrupt end on a sunny afternoon. The rebel army, whose hearts and minds were filled with excitement and fear, finally succeeded in forcing the ghost mecha to reveal itself. Under the encirclement of countless heavy weapons, the tattered peach miasma mecha was like a frightened metal statue, silently stopping in the middle of a farm. However, there was no one inside the peach miasma mecha. The spy from the Royal Intelligence Bureau who had infiltrated the rebel army, at the cost of his life, had successfully lured a small gap into the rebel army's encirclement. After receiving the latest information, Huai Chaoshu resolutely abandoned the mecha she relied on to shock the universe and sweep through the wilderness. She and Su Lu braved the great danger and followed the gap, following a secret path in the sea of mulberry trees to arrive at a silk processing factory in the southwest. Chapter 602. An official of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency, disguised as a foreign trader in a silk processing factory, or more accurately, a foreign trader in a silk processing factory who worked for the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency, received two extremely skinny young men in tattered clothes at the sewers outside the walls of an unassuming silk processing factory. The merchant didn't dare to look directly at these two targets of his, nor did he dare to discuss them in his heart. He only dared to lower his head and respectfully lead them past the walls, arriving at a small, dark, and remote room. Only then did he dare to raise his hand to wipe the sweat off his forehead. He then turned around and knelt down. In a trembling voice, he said, "Your Highness, we have failed in our work, causing Your Highness to be in danger for so many days. We truly deserve to die." Huai Chaoshi didn't recognize this merchant. She hadn't been in charge of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency for long, and hadn't even seen all of the officials in charge of the various prefectural planets, let alone this merchant, who was only an unassuming fourth-rank liaison officer on Liban Star. They hadn't been able to discover the plot of the noble's betrayal in advance, and they hadn't been able to warn them in advance, causing Her Highness to be surrounded by the rebel army. This was the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency's greatest humiliation, as well as its greatest fear. If Her Highness had really been harmed in this rebellion, the grief of His Majesty and the anger of the populace would probably cause thousands of officials to lose their jobs or even die. We'll investigate the responsibility later. What are the next arrangements? Huai Chaoshi didn't give any warm words of encouragement to her subordinates in this tense moment. She said in an extremely cold voice, "Has there been any news from Tianjing planet? The information channel should have already been opened." The merchant wiped the cold sweat off his forehead again. "But this subordinate's rank is too low, so I'm unable to access the information." Huai Chaoshi clearly wasn't satisfied with this answer. The merchant continued respectfully, "The Liban branch office has drawn up 17 escape routes around the Mulberry Sea. All the preparations outside have already been made to receive Her Highness as she leaves. The problem now is how to withdraw from these routes." "Haven't the rebels been moved away?" Huai Chaoshi asked with a frown. "All the factories in Mulberry Sea are under the control of the rebel army. Especially the commercial routes and air routes. The control is very strict. I used some methods to get into this place, but this basic silk workshop is still 7 kilometers away from the next meeting point." The merchant looked at her feet in fear and said, "Most of the rebel army's mobile troops have been sent away by the wrong information, but there is still a heavy infantry battalion on this 7-kilometer road." Su Lu had been listening attentively to the conversation between Huai Chaoshi and the Imperial Intelligence officer. He noticed that the officer's tongue was always curled when he spoke. It was somewhat pleasant to hear, but his trembling voice made him seem particularly fearful. His proficiency in the language of the Empire was rather mediocre, so it was not easy for him to understand the heavily accented sentences. Only then did he realize that he was still in danger. "What do we do next?" he asked. Huai Chaoshi replied calmly, "Of course we're going to break through. That's a heavy infantry battalion, and we don't have mechas." Su Lu frowned and asked in unfamiliar Imperial language, "Why don't we try other routes?" "Because we don't have time." Huai Chaoshi turned her head and looked at him indifferently. Su Lu shrugged and did not express any more opinions. But when the merchant saw this scene, he was somewhat shocked. There was actually someone in this world who dared to use such a tone to speak to Her Highness. This person who spoke with a lisp, as if he had not spoken for many years, what was his background? Is this a level 4 stronghold? Huai Chaoshi no longer paid attention to Su Lu and asked the merchant. The merchant lowered his head and replied, "Your Highness, this is a level 2 stronghold." "Very good." Huai Chaoshi raised her eyebrows and said in a clear voice, "Since this is a level 2 stronghold, then you should immediately prepare your firearms." The merchant and Su Lu were both stunned at the same time. Looking at this person with a thin face, they both thought that she was really going to take a gun and rush into that heavy infantry battalion. I want a lot of guns, big guns. Huai Chaoshi added. No matter how many guns a person had on his back, it was impossible for it to be as dense as a forest. But if she had 3 Gatling guns on her back, then the bullets would be more dense and violent than a rainstorm. The high-speed and sharp bullets were shot out from the rough barrels of the Gatling guns, accompanied by a pungent burnt smell and the strange smell of the cold system. The bullets tore the air above the grassy slope and formed countless terrifying rays, blasting the barracks in front of them into countless pieces of smoke and dust. With a pale face, Su Lok followed the moving human-shaped barracks in front of him and quickly ran forward. Looking at this scene, he couldn't help but think of a prehistoric monster that kept spitting out flames, and it was a female. Huai Chaoshi was not very beautiful, but if she washed her cheeks clean, she could be considered delicate and pretty. She did not look like those terrifying prehistoric monsters at all. However, a skinny woman carrying 3 heavy Gatling guns and madly shooting while running, with clear muscle traces faintly visible on her arms under the military sleeves, such a terrifying woman could no longer be considered a woman, or even a human. Motherfucker, what a monster! Su Lok subconsciously muttered, but his voice was immediately covered by the deafening gunshots. In the eyes of the Federal forces and the Empire's soldiers who had fought with him before, he was without a doubt a monster. But now, he realized that this princess was even more of a monster than he was. How could such a skinny body contain such terrifying power? The Empire's Gatling guns were as famous as the Federation's Darlin cannons. They were extremely heavy, and in addition to the huge amount of ammunition required to continuously fire, anyone could estimate the weight of the guns to be jaw-dropping. But Huai Chaoshi lifted them up as if they were light. Using her skinny body to carry a moving ammunition depot, she launched an attack at a heavy infantry barracks. What did you say? Huai Chaoshi's slender waist turned slightly, and the 3 Gatling guns on her back roared as they changed their angle, blasting the military vehicle 300 meters away into pieces, causing a small explosion. I said, I have muscles too, Su Lok replied loudly with some anger. At this moment, he thought of Xiong Linquan, the Xiong Linquan who was as strong as an overlord, but could only carry 1 Darlin cannon. The 3 heavy Terran heavy machine guns were thrown into the pond, creating a huge wave. The fishes in the pond fled in all directions in fear. When the hot gun barrels came into contact with the slightly cold pond water, a sizzling sound was heard, and a few puffs of white smoke rose. A few intelligence officers disguised as workers nervously removed the empty magazines from Huai Chaoshi's body, but they almost hit their own feet. After successfully breaking through, it should be said that they unreasonably destroyed the outermost line of defense of the rebel army in Mulberry Sea, Huai Chaoshi and Su Lok followed the intelligence officers who had been waiting for a long time on a single-track freight train and arrived at the next rendezvous point as quickly as possible. They boarded a small interplanetary spaceship. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.